Welcome to Forgotten Slumber, the channel where the darkest corners of history come alive. Tonight, we descend into the shadowed halls of medieval dungeons, where fear was law and pain was power. Imagine stone walls damp with cold, flickering torchlight casting dancing shadows, and chains swaying silently in empty corridors. Every device, from the rack to Iron Maidens, was crafted with terrifying precision, not just to punish, but to send a message that law, faith, and authority could never be escaped. Whispers of agony, legends of cruelty, and the ingenuity behind each instrument reveal a world both horrifying and fascinating. It is a history that shocks, yet reminds us of the human mind's capacity to build order from fear as you drift through this story. Remember, these are not just tools of pain. They are echoes of a society obsessed with control, obedience, and spectacle. That if you want more journeys into history's shadows, subscribe to Forgotten Slumber, hit the bell icon, and prepare to explore a world where darkness is never far from the light. Chapter 1: Shadows of Pain. An introduction to torture in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is often remembered for its soaring cathedrals, gallant knights, and illuminated manuscripts. But beneath the beauty of stained glass windows and the poetry of troubadours lay another world, one of shadows, fear, and pain. It was a world where punishment was not only a matter of law but of spectacle, a performance designed to terrify as much as it was to correct. And at the center of this world stood the practice of torture, a brutal, ritualized method of reinforcing authority, rooting out crime, and preserving order in a society where fear was a language understood by all. To understand medieval torture, one must first understand the medieval mind. This was a society built on hierarchy and obedience. Kings ruled by divine right, lords ruled by land and loyalty, and the church ruled by faith and fear of eternal damnation. To disrupt this order, by stealing, rebelling, heresy, or even questioning authority, was more than just a crime. It was a challenge to the very balance of the cosmos. For a medieval man or woman, sin, crime, and punishment were intertwined. A thief was not only stealing bread, he was breaking God's commandment. A heretic was not only speaking against the church, he was threatening the salvation of every soul in the community. It was this belief, this fusion of crime with sin, that justified methods of punishment we now view with horror. Pain was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, at least not in theory. Pain was purifying. Suffering was cleansing. To endure agony, to confess beneath torment, was to reveal truth and to balance the scales of order. Torture was not a hidden shame, but a public affirmation of power, and it was woven into the fabric of medieval life in ways both seen and unseen. Justice in a harsh world. Daily life in the Middle Ages was precarious. Famine, plague, and war hovered over every village and city. Justice, therefore, was not designed to be merciful, but to maintain order in a fragile world. A single murder could spiral into a blood feud between families. A theft of grain might lead to starvation for an entire community. The law had to be swift, visible, and unforgettable, but there was a problem. Evidence, as we think of it today, barely existed. There were no fingerprints, no forensic sciences, no DNA tests to prove guilt or innocence. Instead, law relied on oaths, testimonies, and ordeals. If a man swore he was innocent and others vouched for his honesty, he might be acquitted. If the community distrusted him, suspicion was enough to condemn. Torture emerged as the so-called solution to uncertainty. By inflicting unbearable suffering, authorities believed they could compel truth. If the accused confessed, the matter was settled. If they withstood the pain without breaking, it was sometimes seen as a sign of innocence, or, in darker moments, of diabolical protection. The language of fear. Torture was more than a method of extracting confessions. It was a language, a way of communicating power. Imagine the medieval town square, cobblestones wet with rain, villagers gathered in hushed silence, the iron chains of a prisoner clinking as they are dragged to the center. The bailiff reads out the charges. The device of torture stands waiting, perhaps the pillory, the rack, or the scourge. Everyone watches, children included. The punishment that follows is not simply for the accused. It is for the entire community. In this way, torture was theater. It was spectacle. The screams of the condemned were meant to echo in the minds of all who witnessed, a warning carved in sound and sight. Do not rebel. Do not steal. Do not blaspheme. This will be your fate if you dare. Fear was cheaper than mercy. And in a society with little room for rebellion, fear was effective. The church and the church's influence over torture cannot be overstated. Sin and crime were inseparable, and the church claimed authority over both. Inquisitors believed pain could purify the soul, forcing a heretic to confess and repent before death. Better, they thought, to suffer a few hours in this life than burn eternally in the next. The confessional booth and the torture chamber were, in this twisted logic, two sides of the same coin, both designed to expose sin and restore order. This theology was terrifyingly effective. To confess under torture was to restore one's place in God's order, even if execution soon followed. Many victims believed their torment was not only punishment, but salvation. Pain was recast as divine justice, giving torture a spiritual justification that made it acceptable to both rulers and clergy. The devices await the medieval imagination was vast and merciless. Over centuries, craftsmen and executioners devised an arsenal of instruments designed to stretch, crush, pierce, burn, and humiliate. The rack, where limbs were pulled apart until joints snapped. The wheel, where bones were shattered in public. The Iron Maiden, with its cruel spikes. The Judas cradle, the pair of anguish, the scavenger's daughter, each name a whisper of nightmare. Some of these devices are real, some exaggerated, and others perhaps inventions of later storytellers. Yet all reflect the dark fascination of a society obsessed with order through pain. Each device carried not just physical cruelty, but symbolic meaning. The wheel was a cosmic punishment, a turning of fate. Fires symbolized purification. Spikes represented sin piercing the soul. Torture was never random. It was ritual, carefully staged to embody the values and fears of the age. The human cost yet behind every device, every ritual of pain, was a human being. A thief with calloused hands, a peasant woman accused of witchcraft, a noble fallen from grace. Their cries, their terror, their whispered prayers in the darkness of a dungeon. These are the echoes that linger through history. The medieval world may have justified torture as necessary, but for the victims, it was nothing less than a descent into living hell. The stories of these men and women, often lost in the official records, are crucial to understanding the human dimension of torture. Each confession extracted under torment was written into court rolls, each execution remembered in whispers. And so, history carries both the machinery of cruelty and the memory of its victims. Shadows moving forward. This chapter is but an introduction, a doorway into the world of medieval torture. As we move forward, we will step deeper into the dungeons, examine the devices one by one, and uncover the rituals that shaped them. Each chapter will draw back the curtain on a specific instrument or method: the rack, the wheel, the boot, the cradle, the iron, the flame. But remember, this is not only a story of pain. It is a story of power, of authority maintained through fear, of society preserved by spectacle, of faith twisted into justification. Torture was not an accident of history. It was a system, and it left behind echoes that haunt us still as you drift deeper into this history. Imagine the torchlight flickering on cold stone walls, the iron scent of chains, the silence of a crowd waiting for justice to fall. This was the Middle Ages, a world of faith and fear, of ritual and cruelty, of shadows that speak even now. Chapter 2. The Dungeon and the Rack, stretching the limits of humanity. Beneath the castles and town halls of medieval Europe, far from the sunlight, there existed spaces designed for fear. Dungeons, damp, dark, and heavy with silence, were more than mere prisons. They were theaters of pain, chambers where power revealed itself most nakedly. And within these cold vaults, one device above all came to symbolize the very essence of medieval torture: the rack. The rack was not just an invention of cruelty. It was the embodiment of a worldview. To stretch a man until his joints cracked was not only to punish his body, but to unmake him, to strip away defiance and reveal the fragile truth beneath. It was a ritual of domination, carefully staged in stone rooms where the cries of the suffering echoed long after the chains grew still. The dungeon, a world below. To imagine the rack, one must first imagine its setting. Medieval dungeons were not the expansive labyrinths of modern imagination, but practical, suffocating spaces. Carved into castle basements or hidden beneath civic halls, they were often little more than stone chambers with straw scattered on the floor. Torches flickered on damp walls, leaving shadows that seemed to dance like specters. Chains clinked in the silence, and the air was heavy with the smell of mold, sweat, and iron. Prisoners rarely remained in dungeons for long. They were holding places, not permanent jails. In most towns, justice was swift. A thief might be caught, interrogated, and executed within days. But in the meantime, the dungeon was where fear began its work. The anticipation of torment, the whispers of what awaited, could be as terrifying as the torture itself. Executioners, grim professionals, both feared and respected, presided over these spaces. They were craftsmen of pain, often trained in multiple techniques, and their presence was enough to silence a crowd. Unlike today's notion of a faceless villain, medieval executioners were public figures necessary for the enforcement of justice. They knew the human body intimately, where tendons stretched, where bones snapped, and where pain lingered longest. In their hands, the rack became a tool of terrible precision. The rack, anatomy of a device. The rack was deceptively simple. It consisted of a rectangular wooden frame, large enough for a man to lie stretched upon it. At each end, rollers turned by handles or wheels held ropes tied to the prisoner's wrists and ankles. When the rollers were turned, the ropes tightened. Slowly, steadily, the victim's body was pulled taut. At first, the muscles strained. Then joints dislocated. Eventually, ligaments tore and bones cracked. What made the rack so infamous was not only its capacity for agony, but its control. Unlike execution, which ended in death, the rack allowed torment to be inflicted gradually, at the torturer's discretion. A turn of the wheel might cause unbearable pain, yet leave the victim alive. Another turn might cripple him permanently. Another still could end him. The rack was both a question and an answer. Will you confess? Followed by, now you must. And confess they did. In a world where truth was elusive, the rack was seen as the surest path to it. Authorities believed no one could withstand such suffering without speaking the truth. Of course, the reality was that under torment, the human mind would say anything to make the pain stop. False confessions abounded, and the rack often served more as a tool of spectacle than of justice. Ritual of the rack. A session on the rack was not chaos, but ritual. Prisoners were often interrogated formally as the device was used. Scribes recorded every word, carefully noting confessions, retractions, or pleas for mercy. Witnesses might attend, clerics, officials, even townsfolk, to observe the power of justice at work. The condemned was bound to the frame, the ropes fastened tight. The executioner, often in leather garments, stood by the wheel. A magistrate or inquisitor posed questions. Did you conspire? Who aided you? Do you deny the charge? Each denial was met with a signal, and the wheel turned another notch. The cries that followed were not simply pain. They were answers, written into the air for all present. Sometimes, the rack was not intended to kill, but to cripple. Victims might be released after interrogation, their bodies broken as a living testament to the price of disobedience. Others never left the dungeon alive, their confessions silenced by death itself. The rack thus served both as punishment and propaganda, a warning embodied in twisted limbs and shattered joints. Symbolism of stretching. The imagery of the rack was powerful. To stretch a man was to unmake his natural form, to unravel his humanity. It symbolized both the fragility of flesh and the absolute power of authority. In Christian metaphor, it even echoed crucifixion, the ultimate display of suffering and submission. To the onlookers, the rack was more than wood and rope. It was a vision of divine and earthly justice intertwined. Historical cases. Records of the rack are scattered through Europe. In England, it gained particular notoriety in the Tower of London, where traitors and conspirators were stretched. The Duke of Exeter's daughter, as the rack was nicknamed there, was used on political prisoners suspected of treason. Inquisitors in continental Europe used similar devices during heresy trials, seeking to root out hidden networks of dissent. One chilling case comes from the 16th century, when Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest, was arrested for treason. Though he denied the charges, he was placed on the rack in the tower. Witnesses recorded how his limbs were so disjointed that he could barely move, yet his spirit remained defiant. His story reveals the paradox of the rack. While it sought to break the body, it sometimes immortalized resistance. Fear beyond the dungeon. Perhaps the greatest power of the rack was not the pain it inflicted, but the fear it inspired. The mere rumor of its use was enough to silence dissent. People whispered of joints snapping, of men leaving the dungeon crawling on hands and knees. Even those who never saw it firsthand could imagine its horrors, and imagination often magnified reality. In this way, the rack became larger than itself. It was not just a device. It was a specter that haunted the medieval mind. To be accused of crime was terrifying enough. To be told you might face the rack was to stand at the edge of despair. Fear did the work of chains, binding communities to obedience long before anyone was dragged into the dungeon. The rack's legacy, the rack's reputation, did not end with the Middle Ages. For centuries, it was invoked as the epitome of cruelty. Later generations, horrified by the idea of its use, exaggerated its frequency and its horrors, making it a symbol of everything dark about medieval justice. Some historians argue that the rack was not as common as legend suggests, but its impact on imagination is undeniable. In the popular mind, the rack is the medieval torture device. It stands as a reminder of what fear and authority can do when unchecked, and it challenges us to reflect on the blurred line between justice and cruelty. Closing the dungeon door as we leave the dungeon and step away from the rack, the echoes of its victims still linger. The device may have been dismantled centuries ago, but the memory of its use endures. It tells us that justice in the Middle Ages was never just about guilt or innocence. It was about power, spectacle, and the fear that held societies together. In the next chapter, we will turn to another infamous instrument of torment, the breaking wheel. A device not confined to dungeons, but displayed in open air, where the shattered bodies of the condemned told stories written in bone. Where the rack was private ritual, the wheel was public theater. Together, they reveal two faces of medieval cruelty, one in the silence of stone, the other under the gaze of the crowd. Chapter 3. The Breaking Wheel. Bones shattered before the crowd. If the rack represented the secret, whispered terror of the dungeon, the breaking wheel was its opposite, a brutal spectacle carried out beneath the open sky. It was not hidden in the shadows, but placed deliberately in the public square, where entire communities could witness the unmaking of a body, where the rack whispered fear into the walls of stone chambers. The wheel shouted terror from hilltops and market squares. It was justice performed as theater, a grim performance meant to etch itself into memory and echo through generations. A device of simple horror, the breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel in later folklore, was deceptively simple in construction. It was often an ordinary wagon wheel, the kind that carried goods across muddy medieval roads. But in the hands of executioners, it became a canvas of agony. The condemned was laid upon the ground, limbs stretched wide. The executioner would take a heavy iron bar or hammer and bring it down upon the arms and legs, shattering the bones one by one. The broken body was then woven into the spokes of the wheel, tied with ropes, or sometimes left to hang in grotesque contortions. Once fastened, the wheel was raised upon a pole or mounted on a post, elevating the condemned above the crowd. There they remained, broken, bleeding, and often still alive, left to die slowly under the gaze of neighbors, strangers, and even children brought to watch. The public theater of pain. Unlike the rack, which operated in silence and secrecy, the breaking wheel was deliberately public. Authorities chose locations carefully: crossroads, marketplaces, or hills just outside the town walls. The condemned's suffering was not only punishment but a sermon, an unspoken warning that echoed louder than any law. The execution was staged with ceremony. Bells tolled, heralds proclaimed the crimes, and the condemned was paraded to the site. Crowds gathered, sometimes traveling from nearby villages, drawn by the grim promise of spectacle. Vendors might even sell food and drink as if it were a festival. Justice was not private business. It was a communal ritual, and the wheel was its altar. The breaking of bones was rhythmic and deliberate. First an arm, then a leg, then another. each blow timed to prolong agony. Executioners were skilled, trained to strike with precision so as not to kill too quickly. In some cases, the condemned begged for a final strike to the chest or head, a mercy blow known as the coup de grace. But mercy was rare, and suffering was part of the performance. Symbolism of the wheel carried heavy symbolism. In Christian Europe, it echoed divine justice. As the wheel turned, so too did the fate of sinners. It was both a literal instrument of torture and a metaphor for the cycle of sin, punishment, and redemption. Its circular shape spoke to eternity, a reminder that divine judgment was endless and inescapable. For the audience, the wheel was a symbol of order restored, chaos broken, and authority made visible. The shattered body became a living, or dying, lesson written in flesh and bone. Crimes worthy of the wheel. The breaking wheel was reserved for crimes deemed most serious: murder, treason, banditry, and sacrilege. In a world where theft might lead to flogging or hanging, the wheel was the fate of those considered truly dangerous to society. Highway robbers were frequent victims, their bodies displayed at the very crossroads where they once preyed on travelers. Murderers were broken in the same marketplaces where they had spilled blood. Traitors found themselves shattered as symbols of the destruction of rebellion. The punishment extended beyond death. A corpse left upon the wheel became a warning to passers-by, its bones picked clean by crows. Sometimes bodies remained for weeks, even months, a grotesque landmark at the edge of town. The executioner's craft to wield the wheel was an art, grim though it was. Executioners were trained to break bones in a specific sequence, beginning with the limbs furthest from the heart to prolong life. A poorly executed breaking could end in death too quickly, disappointing the crowd and undermining the intended lesson. Some accounts tell of executioners who struck with such force that the condemned's cries silenced the onlookers. Others speak of victims who endured for hours, clinging to life with shattered frames, whispering prayers or curses as the crowd looked on. The role of the executioner was paradoxical. Feared for his skill, yet necessary for justice. He was both servant and master of the law. And in his hands, the wheel became not only a device, but a performance. Stories from the wheel history records chilling stories of those condemned to the wheel. In 1581, the infamous German bandit Peter Neers was captured after years of terrorizing travelers. Accused of hundreds of murders and acts of sorcery, he was broken on the wheel in a public execution that lasted days. His name became synonymous with horror, his fate a legend told long after his bones had vanished at in France. Accounts describe criminals who survived the breaking longer than expected, sometimes granted a final act of mercy by a priest or a swift blow from the executioner. Yet, even in mercy, the lesson was clear. The wheel left no one untouched by fear. Fear as social glue. The breaking wheel was more than punishment. It was social control. In villages and towns where the reach of central authority was limited, the spectacle of the wheel ensured obedience. To see a neighbor's body shattered and displayed was to internalize the lesson. Crime led to destruction, and rebellion led to ruin. Children grew up with the image of the wheel imprinted upon their imaginations. Travelers passed beneath its shadow. Merchants carried stories of its victims to distant lands. Fear spread wider than any law could reach, binding communities together in obedience to authority. Decline of the wheel. As Europe entered the modern age, the wheel's use slowly declined. Enlightenment thinkers condemned it as barbaric, and new methods of execution replaced it. Yet its memory lingered. The very phrase, "to be broken on the wheel," entered language as a metaphor for destruction beyond repair. The wheel faded from use, but it remained in stories, folklore, and nightmares. Its image was etched into woodcuts, chronicles, and plays, ensuring that future generations would remember its horror. Legacy of the wheel today. The breaking wheel is remembered not only as a device of torture, but as a symbol of an era where justice and spectacle intertwined. It challenges us to reflect on the power of fear, the role of public punishment, and the fragile line between order and cruelty. To be broken on the wheel was not merely to die. It was to become a story, a warning, and a memory carved into the consciousness of an entire community. Closing reflections. As we leave the shadow of the breaking wheel, we step away from the noise of the crowd and the silence of the dead. Its echoes remind us that medieval justice was not hidden but displayed, not whispered but shouted across fields and villages. In the next chapter, we descend once again into the darker recesses of the dungeon to confront another infamous tool, the Iron Maiden. Whether myth or reality, it has become one of the most enduring images of medieval cruelty, a coffin of spikes that promised death in silence. Chapter 4. The Iron Maiden, Myth and Reality of the Spiked Coffin. Few torture devices loom as large in the popular imagination as the Iron Maiden, a towering, coffin-shaped sarcophagus lined with cruel spikes, ready to embrace its victim in a suffocating, piercing death. The image is unforgettable, a heavy iron shell, adorned with grim faces or grotesque engravings, opening like the jaws of a beast to swallow the condemned. But here lies the paradox. The Iron Maiden is perhaps the most famous medieval torture device that may never have truly existed in the Middle Ages at all. The legend of the Iron Maiden for centuries. The Iron Maiden has been presented as the epitome of medieval cruelty, a device that combined imprisonment, impalement, and suffocation. Victims, it was said, were placed within the narrow metal chamber, spikes arranged so that they would pierce but not instantly kill, ensuring prolonged agony. Some versions describe spikes aimed at vital organs, others at soft flesh, guaranteeing pain without a swift death. Yet the earliest confirmed accounts of an Iron Maiden appear not in the Middle Ages, but centuries later, during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. Many historians now argue that the Iron Maiden was a myth, a story pieced together from fragments of older devices like the shandmantle, a shame cloak of iron, and coffins used for execution displays. The Iron Maiden, then, may not have been medieval at all, but rather an invention, or reinvention, designed to illustrate the supposed savagery of the Middle Ages when viewed through the eyes of later, enlightened generations. Why the myth took root? If the Iron Maiden was largely a fabrication, why did it become so famous? The answer lies in its symbolism. The Iron Maiden was not just a tool of pain. It was a story, a metaphor for the cruelty and superstition often associated with the medieval world. By exaggerating its horrors, later historians and chroniclers painted the Middle Ages as a time of barbarism, contrasting it with the progress of their own eras. Exhibitions of Iron Maidens began to appear in museums and fairs during the 18th and 19th centuries. Crowds marveled at these terrifying contraptions, believing they were authentic relics of medieval punishment. In reality, many were cobbled together from genuine fragments of armor, execution devices, or even simple iron coffins, reconstructed into a terrifying shape that fit the public's expectations. The Iron Maiden, therefore, represents less a genuine medieval device and more a cultural invention, a story about cruelty, told through iron and imagination. The shandmantle, a likely inspiration. The shandmantle, or cloak of shame, was a very real punishment tool in medieval Europe. It was a barrel-shaped cage of iron or wood, worn over the body like a humiliating garment. The condemned was paraded through town, mocked, and sometimes left to stand for hours in public squares. Unlike the Iron Maiden, the shandmantle was not intended to kill, but to humiliate, to weigh down the body and spirit. Some were lined with spikes pointing inward, not sharp enough to pierce deeply but pressing into the flesh, creating discomfort and pain. It is easy to see how later storytellers, seeking to dramatize medieval cruelty, might have exaggerated this into a deadly spiked coffin, coffins, cages, and display. Another likely inspiration for the Iron Maiden myth was the widespread medieval practice of using iron cages or coffins for display. Criminals, particularly executed traitors or notorious thieves, were sometimes placed in iron frames resembling coffins or hanging cages. Their bodies would be left exposed to the elements and scavenging birds, serving as a grim warning to all who passed by. These displays were not devices of torture in themselves, but they created powerful images of death within iron enclosures. Later generations may have merged this imagery with tales of spikes and torture, giving birth to the legend of the Iron Maiden, a device of fear. Whether real or imagined, even if the Iron Maiden never truly stood in a medieval dungeon, its story had power. The very idea of being locked in an iron coffin, unable to move, pierced from every side, is a primal fear, claustrophobia, suffocation, impalement, and helplessness combined in one. In this way, the Iron Maiden represents the essence of torture itself, not only the infliction of physical pain, but the cultivation of overwhelming dread. Whether it was real or imagined, the Maiden fulfilled the purpose of all torture devices: to terrify, to control, and to remind society of the terrible consequences of disobedience. Notorious Iron Maidens. Several physical Iron Maidens still exist today, displayed in museums across Europe. The most famous example is the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, first described in the 18th century. This towering structure, over 7 feet tall, resembles a coffin with 2 hinged doors, each lined with spikes. Visitors were told it was used in the Middle Ages to punish heretics and criminals. Yet, modern historians point out that the Nuremberg Maiden was likely assembled from unrelated medieval fragments in the 1700s. The spikes were too unevenly placed to allow for a human body to fit, and there are no reliable medieval records of its use. Despite this, the Nuremberg Maiden became infamous, its legend spreading across Europe and beyond. Writers, painters, and storytellers seized upon its horrifying image, embedding it in the cultural memory as if it had always been real. The Iron Maiden in culture, from Gothic novels to horror films. The Iron Maiden has become a symbol of cruelty, mystery, and medieval darkness. It appears in literature, paintings, and even heavy metal music, the band Iron Maiden taking its name from the device, turning fear into art. Its cultural life has outlasted any real medieval torture device. The Maiden's image, spiked, silent, and waiting, continues to haunt the imagination, even if its historical reality is doubtful. What the myth reveals, the story of the Iron Maiden tells us as much about later centuries as it does about the Middle Ages. By inventing or exaggerating such a device, Enlightenment and Victorian writers reinforced their narrative of progress. Look how brutal the past was. Look how civilized we are now. In this sense, the Iron Maiden became propaganda, a story used to create distance between eras. But it also reminds us of the human fascination with cruelty. People wanted to believe in the Iron Maiden because it fit their vision of the medieval world: dark, terrifying, and otherworldly. Fear beyond the dungeon, whether it truly pierced flesh or only pierced the imagination. The Iron Maiden worked as intended. It inspired fear. Its legend became as effective as any real execution, keeping alive the sense of dread that authority relied upon. In medieval times, fear itself was a tool of power, and the Iron Maiden, real or imagined, was the perfect embodiment of that strategy. Closing thoughts: the Iron Maiden stands at the crossroads of history and myth. It may never have been hammered together in a medieval smithy or slammed shut in a torchlit dungeon, yet it has lived longer than almost any real device of torture. Its story continues to shape our perception of the Middle Ages, reminding us that sometimes legends are more powerful than reality. As we close this chapter, we step away from the looming coffin and its spikes, leaving behind the debate of myth versus fact. In the next chapter, our path leads us back into the certainties of the dungeon, to a device both real and devastating: the Judas Cradle, a pyramid-shaped instrument designed to pierce dignity and body alike, combining humiliation with unbearable pain. Chapter 5: The Judas Cradle, the Pyramid of Pain. Among the arsenal of medieval torture devices, few are described with as much unease and revulsion as the Judas Cradle. Known in some accounts as the culla di Giuda or the Italian chair, this device embodied both physical agony and psychological humiliation. At its core, the Judas Cradle was deceptively simple: a wooden or metal pyramid mounted on a sturdy base. Yet its simplicity hid a cruelty that pushed the human body and mind to the limits of endurance. The design of the cradle: the Judas Cradle was shaped like a pyramid, with a sharp, pointed tip rising upward. The victim, stripped of dignity as well as clothing, was suspended by ropes or placed carefully above the pyramid, then slowly lowered onto the tip. The point was never sharp enough to pierce fatally in an instant. Instead, it pressed into the most sensitive areas of the human body, often the anus or genitals. Sometimes the armpits or other soft tissues were targeted. The victim's weight determined the depth of penetration. Guards or torturers could manipulate ropes to increase or decrease pressure, prolonging the torment for hours or even days. For the condemned, Every movement meant greater pain. Struggling only worsened the injury. The victim's own body weight was both executioner and accomplice. The purpose: pain and humiliation. The Judas cradle was not simply a tool of bodily torture. It was also a theater of humiliation. Victims were exposed publicly, their suffering visible to onlookers. The shame of nakedness, combined with the degradation of such a grotesque position, reinforced the power of those in authority. Like many medieval punishments, the cradle functioned as much as a warning as it did a punishment. The sight of someone suspended helplessly above the pyramid, writhing, weeping, and gasping for relief that never came, served as a grim deterrent. This blending of physical pain with public humiliation made the Judas cradle one of the most psychologically devastating instruments of torture in the medieval imagination. Historical origins: the precise origins of the Judas cradle are shrouded in mystery. Some sources place its invention in Italy during the late Middle Ages, while others suggest Spain during the Inquisition. In both contexts, it was associated with institutions that wielded torture as a means of enforcing obedience: inquisitorial courts, secular rulers, and city magistrates. Unlike devices such as the rack or the stocks, the Judas cradle left few archaeological remains. It was often constructed from wood with iron reinforcements, materials that decayed over centuries. Much of what we know comes from written accounts, drawings, and later descriptions. Some historians question whether it was as widely used as legend claims, or whether its fame grew through exaggerated storytelling. But whether mythologized or not, the image of the Judas cradle struck fear into medieval hearts. That a ritual of terror. The use of the Judas cradle was often ritualistic. Victims were stripped, bound, and hoisted before a crowd. A torturer might read charges aloud, or priests might recite prayers, framing the punishment as divine justice. Then, the lowering began. Inch by agonizing inch, the victim descended toward the pyramid. Muscles tightened in futile resistance. When flesh finally met the point, screams filled the chamber. Torturers adjusted the descent to prolong suffering. Sometimes the victim was left hovering just above the pyramid, forced to stare at the sharp tip while anticipating the inevitable. This anticipation itself was torture, a psychological breaking point that could drive confessions before the descent even began. The length of suffering. The true horror of the Judas cradle lay in its duration. Unlike swift executions, this device inflicted slow, excruciating pain that could last hours or days. Some victims were forced to remain seated upon the pyramid for extended periods. To prevent infection or quick death, torturers might keep them alive with food and water, prolonging the agony. Muscles eventually cramped, skin tore, and infection spread. Death, when it came, was not immediate but gradual, through exhaustion, internal injury, or sepsis. The Judas cradle, then, was not just punishment but a drawn-out annihilation of body and spirit. The symbolism of Judas. Why the name Judas? The association likely stems from betrayal. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Christ. The cradle symbolized treachery and punishment for traitors, heretics, and criminals. Sitting upon the pyramid was seen as the ultimate degradation, an inversion of honor and dignity. In some interpretations, the pyramid itself resembled a mockery of the church's symbols, a cruel parody of the stability and faith embodied in sacred architecture. Whether intentional or not, the Judas cradle carried an aura of spiritual as well as physical condemnation. Public spectacle. Though some torture devices were confined to dungeons, the Judas cradle was often displayed in public squares or execution sites. Its very shape drew attention, and its use demanded an audience. Crowds gathered to witness the punishment, their reactions ranging from horrified fascination to grim satisfaction. For authorities, such spectacles reinforce control. See what happens to those who betray, defy, or disobey. Children, merchants, nobles, all could witness the degradation. The collective memory of such events ensured the cradle's power extended beyond the moment of use. Fear lived on in whispers, warnings, and imaginations. Debate over authenticity. As with the Iron Maiden, some modern historians question whether the Judas cradle was as prevalent as legend suggests. Skeptics argue that descriptions may have been exaggerated by later writers seeking to dramatize the cruelty of the Middle Ages. Still, References to pyramid-shaped torture devices appear in inquisitorial accounts and certain judicial records. While it may not have been common, it was likely real, at least in some form. Even if its use was limited, the Judas cradle became a potent symbol of medieval punishment. Its horrifying imagery was enough to secure its place in history. Whether or not every detail of its legend was true, a device of ultimate control, the Judas cradle demonstrates how medieval torture combined multiple layers of suffering: physical pain, excruciating and relentless; psychological terror, anticipation, humiliation, and despair; public warning, fear projected onto the entire community that it was not just a device, but a message. And that message was clear: power was absolute, and disobedience could strip you of body, dignity, and life itself. Closing reflections: the Judas cradle stands as one of the darkest emblems of medieval punishment. Whether widely used or partially mythologized, it captures the essence of torture in its purest form: pain without release, humiliation without mercy. Its pyramid tip pierced not only flesh, but also the very idea of human dignity. For victims, there was no escape, no hope of swift relief. For onlookers, there was only fear that kept order intact, ensuring obedience through the memory of agony. As we step away from the cradle, we leave behind one of the most humiliating and terrifying punishments of the medieval imagination. Yet the journey is not over. In the next chapter, we enter the shadow of another infamous device, one of stretching limbs and breaking bodies: the rack, the relentless engine of confession. Chapter 6. The rack, stretching the limits of the human body. If there is one torture device that has become the enduring symbol of the Middle Ages, it is the rack. Mention the word torture, and many minds immediately conjure images of a wooden frame, ropes, and the terrible creaking sound of human bodies being stretched beyond their natural limits. The rack was the embodiment of mechanical cruelty, simple in concept, devastating in practice, and notorious in its legacy. The anatomy of the rack at its heart. The rack was a large wooden frame, rectangular in shape, with rollers or windlasses fixed at either end. The victim would be stripped and bound, wrists secured with ropes at one end, ankles at the other. The torturer would then turn the rollers with deliberate precision. With each twist, the ropes tightened, pulling the victim's body taut. Muscles strained, ligaments tore, bones creaked under the unnatural tension. Joints began to dislocate, one after another, until arms and legs were wrenched from their sockets. The true horror of the rack lay not only in pain, but in its gradualness. The torturer could pause at any moment, ask questions, demand confessions, and then resume twisting, ratcheting the agony higher with each turn. Origins and evolution. Though it reached its infamous peak in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, the concept of stretching the human body has much older roots. Ancient Greeks and Romans employed devices that pulled limbs apart. In some cultures, execution by dismemberment, tying a person's limbs to animals or mechanical devices, foreshadowed what the rack would later refine. By the 13th century, the rack had become a standard tool in European judicial torture, especially under the authority of inquisitorial courts and royal justice. Its reputation spread quickly, its image etched into the collective imagination as the very definition of torment. At a theater of confession, the rack was rarely used as a method of punishment alone. Instead, it was a tool of interrogation. Authorities employed it when they believed a person held information or when they demanded a confession. Interrogations under the rack often followed a ritual. The accused was bound, questioned, and urged to speak the truth. If answers were unsatisfactory, the torturer would turn the rollers, slowly, deliberately, while asking again. The creaking of wood and rope became the soundtrack of truth forced from unwilling lips. In some cases, confessions were extracted before a single joint dislocated. The mere threat of the rack enough to break the accused resolve. But for others, silence endured until the body itself betrayed them, torn apart by mechanical force. The physical reality, the damage inflicted by the rack was catastrophic. Victims emerged with permanently dislocated joints, torn muscles, and broken bodies. Even those released alive were often crippled for life. Dislocation, shoulders and hips were often the first to give way, popping audibly as joints slipped from their sockets. Ligament damage. Once ligaments tore, mobility could never be restored. Nerve trauma, stretching compressed nerves, leaving victims paralyzed or in chronic pain. Internal damage, blood vessels ruptured, sometimes leading to shock or death. Unlike some tortures that left scars hidden beneath clothing, the rack left victims visibly broken, their twisted limbs a permanent testimony to their ordeal. Psychological terror. The rack was as much psychological as physical. To be bound, helpless, and stretched while the torturer controlled every movement created despair beyond words. Victims could see the windlass turning, hear the ropes creaking, and feel the body tearing apart in real time. Spectators, whether judges, clergy, or guards, reinforced the terror. The victim knew their agony was not private but observed, judged, and recorded. This loss of dignity compounded the suffering, ensuring that even the memory of the rack haunted survivors. Notable uses in history. The rack became infamous in England, where it was sometimes referred to as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, supposedly after the 15th century nobleman who introduced it to the Tower of London. And Askew, a Protestant reformer, was famously racked in 1546. She was so badly broken that she had to be carried to her execution, unable to walk. During the reign of Elizabeth I, Catholic recusants were stretched to extract confessions of treason. In Spain, the Inquisition relied on devices like the rack to root out heresy, combining spiritual condemnation with physical torment. These examples fueled the rack's legend, cementing it as a symbol of tyranny and cruelty across Europe. Variations across regions. While the general principle of stretching remained constant, regional variations existed. In some designs, the rack had spiked rollers, tearing flesh as well as pulling limbs. Others incorporated weights or pulleys, multiplying the pressure. Certain versions were compact, built into dungeons, while others were grand and portable, moved for public displays. No matter the design, the outcome was the same: unbearable suffering that turned the human body into a battlefield of bones and sinew. Torture as authority. The rack symbolized more than cruelty. It symbolized authority. Its use sent a clear message. Rulers and inquisitors held absolute control over body and spirit. Resistance, silence, or dissent would not be tolerated. The device's very presence in a courtroom or castle dungeon was enough to silence whispers of rebellion. It was not merely a tool, it was an emblem of domination. Ethical and religious justification. How could such brutality be justified? For medieval authorities, torture was often framed as a means of saving souls. By extracting confessions, judges claimed they were bringing sinners to repentance. The suffering of the body was portrayed as cleansing for the spirit. Others justified it politically, maintaining order, deterring treason, protecting the realm. In both cases, the rack was cloaked in the language of necessity, as if the agony it inflicted was a price society had to pay for stability. Survivors and their legacy. Though many perished under the rack, some survived. These survivors often became living warnings, their twisted limbs and hunched postures telling silent stories of what awaited rebels, heretics, or traitors. Such figures haunted towns and villages, visible reminders of power's cruelty. Their broken bodies lived on in memory, fueling tales that were passed down through generations. Decline in memory. By the 18th century, the use of the rack declined as Enlightenment thought challenged the morality and effectiveness of torture. Legal reforms, new philosophies, and changing attitudes toward justice slowly dismantled its role in society. Yet the rack never disappeared from imagination. Writers, artists, and historians invoked its image as the quintessential symbol of medieval darkness. In literature and film, the rack became shorthand for cruelty itself, its creaking ropes echoing through centuries as a reminder of how far human ingenuity could bend toward inhumanity. Closing reflections. The rack was not merely a device. It was a ritual of domination, a theater of confession, and a weapon of control. It broke bones, tore muscles, and shattered spirits. But beyond physical destruction, it instilled fear. Fear that kept populations obedient, that silenced dissent before it could rise. Today, the rack stands as one of history's darkest icons, a reminder of a time when pain was seen as truth's companion and justice's tool. To imagine the turning of its rollers is to imagine the slow unraveling of humanity itself, stretched until nothing remained but silence. And yet, as terrifying as the rack was, it was only one instrument among many. In the next chapter, we descend deeper into the darkness, exploring another infamous device of fire and metal, the iron chair, where sitting became an ordeal of unimaginable pain. Chapter 7. The Iron Chair, the Throne of Agony. Among the many cruel inventions of the medieval world, few carried the symbolic weight of the iron chair. It was a throne not of power, but of torment, a grim parody of kingship, where the condemned sat not to rule, but to suffer. Lined with sharp spikes across its seat, back, armrests, and even footrests, the iron chair transformed the simple act of sitting into an ordeal of unbearable pain, the design of pain at first glance. The iron chair resembled an ordinary piece of furniture, but its purpose was far from ordinary. Constructed from solid wood or iron, its frame was fitted with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of metal spikes. These spikes varied in size and sharpness, designed not necessarily to pierce vital organs, but to inflict constant, unrelenting agony. Victims were stripped and bound tightly to the chair with straps of leather or iron. Their weight forced the spikes deep into flesh. Movement was impossible, for every attempt to shift brought fresh stabbing pain. Some versions of the chair included restraints heated by fire, causing the spikes themselves to burn red-hot, searing the victim's skin. The iron chair was as much a spectacle as a device. To see someone seated upon it was to see the human form transformed into an unwilling monarch of suffering, held aloft in agony. Powerless, a living warning to all who witnessed. Origins and spread. The origins of the iron chair are difficult to trace, for its concept appears in several variations across Europe. It gained prominence during the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, often found in Germanic and Italian states. Its presence in torture chambers became so widespread that chroniclers sometimes referred to it simply as the chair. Its symbolic power made it especially appealing to authorities. Thrones were associated with justice and rulership, and the iron chair inverted that symbolism. The guilty or accused sat enthroned, not to dispense law, but to be consumed by it. In this inversion, the community saw the price of disobedience. A ritual of interrogation like the rack, the iron chair was rarely used as punishment alone. It was primarily an interrogation device. The condemned was seated, bound tightly to prevent movement, and questioned. Judges or inquisitors would demand confessions while the victim writhed in pain, unable to find relief. The torment could be prolonged. Interrogators often heated the chair slowly, stoking coals beneath its base so that the iron warmed gradually. This gave time for questioning, each degree of heat adding intensity. Victims could endure hours of agony before fainting or succumbing to shock. The ritual was deliberate. Questions asked, denials made, the creak of leather straps tightening, and the smell of searing flesh filling the chamber. Every sense was weaponized, every moment calculated to erode resistance. The psychological dimension what made the iron chair particularly terrifying was not only its physical torment, but its psychological impact. To be seated upon a throne has always been a symbol of power, but here the symbolism was twisted. The condemned was enthroned in helplessness, paraded before onlookers as both spectacle and warning. The inversion mocked human dignity, transforming the victim into a grotesque ruler over their own suffering. For communities, witnessing the iron chair in use was unforgettable. The sight of a neighbor, rival, or political dissenter strapped down, bleeding into the spikes, and screaming as the chair glowed with heat imprinted terror into collective memory. The fear spread far beyond the torture chamber. Even those who never saw the device in person carried its legend in whispered stories, a throne of knives, where a single command could turn human flesh into ruin. Notable accounts, while many records of the iron chair have been lost or obscured by time. Chronicles and testimonies give glimpses into its use. In Nuremberg, city records from the 16th century describe a chair of spikes, used to extract confessions from thieves and witches. In Italy, inquisitors employed heated chairs for heretics, noting that confessions were swiftly given when the iron spoke. Folklore recounts stories of nobles who were shown the iron chair as a threat. confessing their plots before ever sitting upon it, though details vary. The theme is consistent. The chair's presence was enough to break resolve, whether through direct torture or through the terror it inspired. Variations of cruelty, the iron chair was not uniform. It evolved in different regions, each variation designed to maximize suffering. Basic spike chairs. Hundreds of spikes covered every surface, including headrests. Victims could bleed profusely simply from being bound. Heated chairs. Fire or coals were placed beneath the seat, heating the spikes until they seared flesh. Weighted versions. Victims were pressed down with heavy bars, forcing spikes deeper into the body. Public display chairs. Some were wheeled into marketplaces, where the condemned sat before the crowd as a warning. Each variation reflected the creativity of cruelty, adapting a simple concept into a terrifying instrument of control. Pain and physiology. The iron chair inflicted a unique kind of pain. Unlike devices that tore or broke the body outright, the chair relied on accumulation. Thousands of small punctures, combined with pressure, restraint, and often heat. Blood loss. The spikes caused constant bleeding, though rarely fatal on their own. Shock. The body, pierced on every surface, often went into shock, leading to unconsciousness. Burns. Heated chairs left charred skin and unbearable agony, often leading to infection. Immobilization. Bound tightly. The victim's inability to move amplified the torment. Survivors were often left scarred, crippled, or psychologically shattered, their bodies testaments to the price of disobedience. Public spectacle. The iron chair was sometimes employed in public settings, particularly during witch trials or executions. The condemned would be paraded to the chair, bound, and displayed before crowds. Even without heating, the sight of someone sitting on spikes, bleeding into their own throne, was a spectacle of shame and suffering. When heat was added, the smell of burning flesh mingled with cries of agony, creating a memory designed to linger in the minds of all who watched. This theatricality was no accident. Public punishment reinforced obedience, using fear as a weapon. The iron chair was both a tool of interrogation and a stage for authority's message: defy, and you too will sit upon the throne of agony. Authority and justification. Why employ such a device? To rulers and inquisitors, the justification was simple. It worked. The iron chair broke resistance, extracted confessions, and demonstrated power. Authorities cloaked their use in moral or legal reasoning. Some argued that the agony purified the soul, forcing repentance. Others claimed it was necessary for the stability of the state. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay the raw reality. Fear kept populations obedient, and nothing embodied fear like the sight of a neighbor enthroned upon spikes. Decline and memory. As with the rack, the iron chair began to fade with the Enlightenment, when ideas of human rights and legal reform challenged the legitimacy of torture. Devices were dismantled, hidden, or repurposed. Yet the memory of the chair remains strong. In museums today, replicas and preserved chairs evoke fascination and horror. Tourists gaze at them, imagining what it must have been like to sit upon such a throne. Writers and filmmakers invoke its image as a shorthand for cruelty, ensuring that the iron chair's legacy endures long after its physical use has ended. Closing reflections. The iron chair was more than a device. It was a symbol. It inverted dignity, mocking the idea of rulership by making suffering the only crown. It turned human beings into spectacles, reduced to writhing bodies on a throne of knives. In its spikes, we see the ingenuity of fear. In its heat, we see the deliberate cruelty of authority. And in its legacy, we see how power used pain not merely to punish, but to rule. We leave the iron chair behind. We turn to another infamous invention of the Middle Ages, the Iron Maiden, a coffin of spikes where death and imprisonment met in chilling silence. Chapter 8. The Iron Maiden, coffin of terror. If the rack symbolized stretching pain and the iron chair symbolized enthroned agony, then the Iron Maiden represented confinement, silence, and death itself. Few medieval torture devices have captured the imagination as strongly as this iron coffin lined with spikes. Its doors closed around a victim, enclosing them in darkness, their flesh pierced but not instantly killed. Whether fact, legend, or exaggeration, The Iron Maiden endures as one of the most chilling symbols of cruelty in the medieval world. The device itself, the Iron Maiden, resembled a standing sarcophagus or coffin, often shaped like a human figure. Tall enough to hold an adult upright, it was hinged at the sides so that the victim could be enclosed within. Inside the doors, spikes were positioned to pierce the body as the device shut. The spikes were carefully arranged, long enough to puncture skin, flesh, and sometimes organs, but rarely positioned to strike immediately fatal blows. The goal was not instant death, but prolonged suffering. Victims were held in forced stillness, pierced from all sides, unable to move without driving the spikes deeper. Some designs included spikes at head height, ensuring punctures to the face or even the eyes. Others left small gaps for breathing or interrogation, allowing tormentors to question the victim or prolong the display. Historical debate. The Iron Maiden is one of the most controversial devices in the history of torture. Many historians argue that its widespread use in the Middle Ages may be more myth than reality. Descriptions of such devices appear in writings from the 18th and 19th centuries, often tied to sensationalist accounts of medieval cruelty. Earlier medieval records rarely mention the Iron Maiden directly, though related devices, spiked coffins, or enclosed chambers, are referenced. Some argue that the Iron Maiden, as popularly imagined, was a later construction, created by combining earlier descriptions of spiked barrels, cages, and sarcophagi. By the 19th century, museums and collectors displayed Iron Maidens as symbols of medieval barbarity, whether authentic or reconstructed. Yet, whether widely used or not, the Iron Maiden's symbolic power was immense. Even as legend, it embodied the fear of confinement and the horror of death by slow impalement. Symbolism of the maiden. Why call such a horrific device a maiden? The irony is deliberate. To step into the Iron Maiden was to step into a grotesque parody of nurture and protection. A maiden, in cultural symbolism, represented purity, gentleness, and care. The Iron Maiden inverted this image. Its embrace was deadly, its nurturing a lie. Enclosed in her arms, the victim found not comfort but agony. This inversion of innocence into cruelty made the device especially terrifying. It was not simply a coffin. It was a mockery of sanctuary, a symbol that even the gentlest images could be twisted into instruments of suffering. Methods of use. When used, the Iron Maiden combined physical torture with psychological despair. Entrapment. Victims were forced inside, the doors closing slowly, spikes piercing the skin. The sensation was one of helpless inevitability. Immobilization. Bound upright, every attempt to move deepened wounds. Even breathing could be agony. Prolongation. Because spikes were not positioned to kill instantly, victims could survive for hours or even days. Blood loss, infection, and exhaustion compounded their torment. Interrogation. Some maidens were designed with small openings so inquisitors could question victims or taunt them while they suffered. The device weaponized silence and darkness. Unlike the spectacle of the rack or iron chair, the Iron Maiden was a hidden torment, enclosing its victim in solitude, sealing them away from the world. Public fear and memory. Whether or not it was widely used, the Iron Maiden left a deep mark on cultural imagination. Tales spread of rulers and inquisitors employing it to punish heretics, traitors, or conspirators. The mere sight of such a coffin, looming in a dungeon, could be enough to terrify prisoners into obedience. Legends told of victims entombed in its spiked embrace, their screams muffled by iron walls. Even as a threat, the Iron Maiden held power. In the medieval mind, the idea of being locked away in eternal torment resonated with religious fears of damnation. The maiden became a worldly image of hell, a dark enclosure, full of pain, with no escape. Accounts and legends. In Nuremberg, an Iron Maiden was famously displayed in the 19th century, though historians believe it was assembled from older artifacts. Visitors marveled at its cruelty, convinced it had been used on heretics and criminals centuries earlier. Folklore describes a ruler who punished liars by placing them in the maiden, declaring that the Iron Woman loved only truth. Some accounts claim maidens were used to execute nobles, their prolonged deaths serving as examples to others. The accuracy of these stories is debated, but their persistence shows the symbolic force of the maiden, more terrifying, perhaps, than its actual use. Psychological torment. What set the Iron Maiden apart was its reliance on psychological dread as much as physical pain. To be locked inside meant complete isolation, darkness pressing in, air growing stale, spikes digging into flesh, silence broken only by one's own ragged breathing. Unlike the public spectacle of the chair or rack, this was a solitary nightmare. Victims could not see their tormentors. They could not cry out to a crowd. They were left alone with the maiden, enclosed in an intimate prison of pain. For many, the terror of anticipation, waiting for death, unsure when it would come, was worse than the wounds themselves. Variations and relatives. The Iron Maiden may not have existed exactly as later depictions show, but related devices certainly did. The spiked barrel. Prisoners were placed in barrels lined with spikes, rolled about to maximize wounds. The Spanish chair, an upright seat with spiked panels that enclosed the victim. Cages and sarcophagi. Iron cages shaped like humans were used to display corpses or confine prisoners. The maiden may have been a fusion of these earlier devices, reimagined by later generations into a single, horrific symbol. From legend to museum. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Iron Maiden became a staple of museum displays. Collectors assembled versions from fragments of old torture devices, presenting them as authentic medieval instruments. Visitors, enthralled by the macabre, saw in them proof of a barbaric past. These exhibitions shaped public imagination. The maiden appeared in literature, art, and theater, its image carried forward into modern horror films and novels. Whether or not it was widely used, its reputation became reality. The Iron Maiden was cemented as an icon of cruelty. Cultural legacy. The Iron Maiden's influence extends beyond history. It has appeared in Gothic fiction, painted as a symbol of doom. In modern times, it lent its name to the legendary heavy metal band, forever associating the phrase with both terror and dark artistry. It remains one of the most recognizable torture devices, even for those unfamiliar with medieval history. Its very shape, a coffin bristling with spikes, is enough to conjure dread. Closing reflections. The Iron Maiden may exist as much in legend as in fact, but its power lies not in numbers used, but in the fear it inspired. It embodied confinement, silence, and the inversion of innocence into cruelty, whether real or reconstructed. Its symbolism is undeniable, a device that turned protection into pain, an embrace into death. As we move forward, we turn from the maiden's silent embrace to another instrument of medieval horror, the Judas cradle, a device where humiliation and suffering were sharpened to their most intimate and degrading extremes. Chapter 9. The Judas Cradle, Pyramid of Pain. Among the dark hallmarks of medieval punishment, the Judas cradle stands out for its combination of ingenuity, cruelty, and psychological torment. Unlike the Iron Maiden, which confined victims in a static coffin of spikes, the Judas cradle employed an entirely different method, one that made pain a slow, drawn-out process and turned humiliation into a public spectacle. Its design, method of use, and legacy all speak to the medieval mindset, where the body could be both a canvas of punishment and a warning to society. The device's design. The Judas cradle was essentially a wooden pyramid or cone, pointed at the top, mounted on a stand or frame. It was sized to fit a human body in such a way that the victim could be placed directly on the apex. Some versions had metal reinforcements at the tip, while others were purely wooden, yet all aimed to create a focused pressure point capable of inflicting excruciating pain. The victim's legs were typically bound, and the body lowered slowly onto the pyramid. Gravity, combined with the victim's weight, forced the body to conform to the shape of the cone, applying pressure to sensitive areas. The goal was not immediate death, but prolonged agony, often compounded by slow, methodical adjustments to increase suffering over time. Psychological dimensions. Pain alone is frightening, but the Judas cradle heightened terror through anticipation and helplessness. The victim could see the device, understand its purpose, and yet had no recourse. Every movement worsened the pain, creating a psychological loop of despair. In addition, the device often forced the victim into a public or semi-public setting, where onlookers could witness the punishment. This public dimension served multiple purposes. It amplified shame, reinforced obedience in the populace, and turned punishment into a cautionary tale that would echo in whispered stories for years to come. Historical accounts and origins documentation on the Judas cradle is less abundant than on some other medieval instruments, but enough references survive to suggest its existence and use, particularly in southern Europe. Spain is frequently cited as a region where inquisitors employed the device, targeting accused heretics, blasphemers, and adulterers. Some records suggest that inquisitors designed the cradle to extract confessions. The pain was intense enough to compel submission, but not so immediate as to kill the victim before revealing information. In this way, the Judas cradle functioned both as torture and interrogation tool, a physical and psychological weapon in the inquisitor's arsenal. While many medieval texts describe the device in chilling detail, some modern historians debate whether it was widely used or mostly a product of sensationalist accounts. Regardless of its prevalence, the image of the Judas cradle has endured, shaping cultural perceptions of medieval cruelty. Method of application: the process of using the Judas cradle was deliberate, ceremonial, and terrifying. Restraint: the victim was typically bound by wrists and ankles, immobilizing them completely. Placement: the body was lowered or seated onto the pointed apex, with careful adjustments to ensure maximum pressure on sensitive areas. Adjustment: torturers could alter the victim's position incrementally, prolonging pain and increasing discomfort. Observation: in some cases, the punishment occurred in view of witnesses, emphasizing both humiliation and moral instruction. Unlike other devices where immediate injury occurred, the Judas cradle's cruelty lay in time and anticipation. Victims would remain trapped for hours, enduring excruciating pressure and slowly increasing pain as the torture continued. The interplay of pain and humiliation: one of the most disturbing aspects of the Judas cradle is its focus on humiliation. Victims were often exposed to the public, forced into positions that violated both physical comfort and social modesty. The act of being bound and impaled, or perceived as such, carried immense social shame, particularly in tightly knit medieval communities. This combination of physical agony and psychological degradation made the device a particularly effective instrument of social control. A single demonstration could deter multiple would-be transgressors, reinforcing obedience not only through fear but through a deep understanding of social norms and consequences. Cultural and symbolic significance: the Judas cradle is named evocatively, linking it to Judas Iscariot, the biblical traitor whose betrayal of Christ represented ultimate moral failure. In medieval symbolism, the device functioned as a moral lesson in corporeal form. Betrayal, heresy, or other crimes were not only punishable but shameful in the most intimate, physical way possible. The connection to biblical narrative added an element of spiritual terror. Victims were not only suffering in the present, they were symbolically punished for sins that threatened their eternal soul. The device thus merged corporeal pain with spiritual fear, aligning with the medieval belief in intertwined earthly and divine justice. Variations across regions: while the general concept of the Judas cradle remained consistent, regional variations introduced different methods of intensifying suffering. Spiked versions: some cradles included small spikes at the apex, ensuring minor but constant punctures. Rotating models: certain accounts describe mechanisms that allowed the pyramid to be rotated or adjusted while the victim was restrained, increasing unpredictability. Combined instruments: occasionally, the Judas cradle was paired with other devices, such as shackles or weights, to magnify the torment. These variations underscore the creativity and cruelty of medieval torture practices, highlighting a society in which punishment was both technical and performative. Psychological endurance and confessions: the Judas cradle, like other instruments, often served a dual purpose: to punish and to elicit confessions. Pain, humiliation, and fear could break even the most steadfast prisoner, leading to admissions of crimes, heresy, or conspiracy. Confessions extracted under such duress are historically controversial. While authorities considered them valid, modern historians recognize that fear and pain could distort testimony, leading to false admissions and miscarriages of justice. Nonetheless, the device's effectiveness in producing compliance reinforced its continued use, both as a practical tool and as a symbol of the Inquisitor's authority. public perception even for those who never encountered the device directly. Tales of the Judas cradle circulated widely. Its legend contributed to a climate of fear and obedience, ensuring that potential offenders understood the stakes of transgression. Stories told of victims who survived only to recount the slow, agonizing descent onto the pyramid, and these accounts served as cautionary tales. The combination of public knowledge, storytelling, and rumor amplified the device's psychological impact far beyond its physical application. The Judas cradle in historical memory. While the Iron Maiden captivated the imagination with the notion of a coffin of spikes, the Judas cradle inspired horror through intimacy and prolonged suffering. Its legacy lives on in folklore, literature, and museum displays, reminding modern audiences of the extremes to which medieval authorities would go to enforce law, morality, and obedience. The device embodies a disturbing principle: the intersection of pain, shame, and power. It was a tool not merely to harm, but to assert control over mind and body, to instill fear that rippled through communities, and to enforce a moral order defined by authority and tradition. Closing reflections. As we leave behind the Judas cradle, we are confronted with the medieval imagination of punishment, where ingenuity met cruelty, and where devices were as much about social instruction as physical torment. The next chapter will explore the breaking wheel, another instrument of terror where punishment was public, deliberate, and designed to leave a permanent mark on the body and on the collective memory of society. Through these stories, one can glimpse the medieval mind, a world where crime, punishment, and morality were intertwined, where fear and obedience walked hand in hand, and where the human body became both instrument and canvas of justice. Chapter 10. The Breaking Wheel spokes of suffering that eye in the grim arsenal of medieval punishments. Few instruments inspired terror as profoundly as the breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel. Its design, function, and ceremonial use reflected a society in which punishment was both a spectacle and a methodical instrument of control. The breaking wheel exemplified the medieval intertwining of justice, fear, and public morality, leaving an indelible mark on history, folklore, and the collective imagination. Origins and design. The breaking wheel's origins trace back to Central and Western Europe, with documented use from the 13th century onward. It consisted of a large wooden wheel, typically between 6 and 12 feet in diameter, mounted horizontally or inclined on a sturdy frame. The wheel's spokes became the tool of agony. The victim's limbs were methodically broken across them using heavy iron bars or hammers. The method of placement varied. In some cases, the accused was tied to the wheel, their body stretched to maximize leverage for bone breaking. In other cases, the wheel itself was spun or rotated to create additional disorientation and terror. Its design was practical, brutal, and deliberately visible, a public stage where punishment, instruction, and fear converged. The purpose of the punishment. The breaking wheel was more than an execution device. It was a tool for prolonged suffering and social deterrence. Victims could endure hours, sometimes days, of pain before death claimed them. This extended agony served multiple purposes: deterrence. Public witnessing of the wheel's use instilled fear in potential offenders. Moral instruction. Punishment symbolized divine justice, illustrating the consequences of sin or crime. Authority. The method demonstrated the absolute power of secular or ecclesiastical authorities over life and body. Medieval society equated physical suffering with moral correction. The breaking wheel exemplified the belief that pain could cleanse the soul, offering spiritual as well as corporeal lessons. Method of application. The process of breaking a person on the wheel was meticulous, ceremonial, and terrifying. Restraint. The accused was securely tied to the wheel, often with arms and legs spread across the spokes. Initial strikes. Torturers used heavy rods or iron bars to shatter the limbs, starting with the legs, then the arms. Each strike was calculated to maximize pain while prolonging survival. Positioning. Victims were sometimes repositioned to intensify agony. Final placement. Once mortally wounded, the victim might be left on the wheel, elevated on a pole, or displayed in a public square until death occurred, creating a horrifying spectacle. The mechanics of the punishment emphasized control, anticipation, and spectacle. transforming the victim into both a participant and a lesson for society. Symbolism and psychological impact. The breaking wheel held profound symbolic significance. Its circular form evoked cosmic or divine order, and the act of breaking a human body across it suggested the power of law and God over life and flesh. Victims were not only punished but marked as transgressors, their suffering a visible testimony to the consequences of crime. The psychological terror was as significant as the physical. Witnesses saw bones shatter and bodies contort, creating a narrative of obedience enforced through fear. Families, friends, and communities absorbed the lesson, internalizing the moral weight of the crime and the omnipresence of authority. Crimes punished by the wheel. The breaking wheel was reserved for severe offenses, particularly murder. Those who took another's life were often subjected to prolonged agony. Treason, betrayal of a lord, monarch, or kingdom invoked extreme punishment. High theft and robbery, crimes that threatened property, commerce, or social stability, could result in execution by wheel. Blasphemy and heresy. In some regions, religious crimes were met with both spiritual and physical punishment. The method was rarely used for minor infractions, emphasizing the severity of the offense and reinforcing societal hierarchies and expectations. Public spectacle. One of the most horrifying aspects of the breaking wheel was its public nature. Executions were often held in marketplaces, town squares, or crossroads, places where maximum exposure could be guaranteed. Spectators watched as limbs were shattered, the victim's body contorted, and life ebbed away over hours. This public dimension served as moral theater. The agony of the punished individual became a cautionary tale, illustrating both the authority of law and the spiritual consequences of crime. In some cases, officials would proclaim the crime aloud, narrating the victim's offenses and ensuring that the lesson was understood by all present. Variations across regions. Different regions adapted the breaking wheel to local customs and symbolism. Vertical versus horizontal placement. In some areas, the wheel was mounted vertically, forcing victims to be suspended, while elsewhere it lay flat, allowing torturers to manipulate limbs with leverage. Number of strikes. Some traditions involved a precise sequence of strikes, emphasizing ritual and fairness. Final elevation. In certain regions, the mortally wounded were displayed elevated on a pole, prolonging the visibility of the punishment and reinforcing the warning to others. These variations demonstrate the adaptability and cultural embedding of medieval punishment methods. Notable historical accounts, chroniclers, and legal documents from medieval Europe often describe the use of the wheel in vivid detail. Victims were sometimes high-profile criminals whose deaths were intended as exemplars for the masses. Stories recount victims crying out, bones snapping, and the quiet of death following prolonged suffering, leaving an impression that was both terrifying and instructive. The Catherine Wheel, named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, reflects this duality. Her martyrdom inspired a device symbolizing both pain and moral retribution, embedding the wheel into cultural and religious consciousness. The psychological toll on society. Witnessing or hearing about punishments on the wheel had profound effects on medieval communities. Reinforcement of obedience. Fear of similar punishment encouraged compliance with laws, customs, and moral codes. Internalization of authority. The combination of spiritual and physical consequences made secular and ecclesiastical power deeply internalized. Transmission of cultural memory. Tales of the wheel were recounted in chronicles, songs, and oral traditions, ensuring that the lesson persisted across generations. In this way, the breaking wheel functioned not only as a device of punishment, but as a mechanism of social education, embedding morality and obedience into the cultural fabric. Ethical reflections from a modern perspective. The breaking wheel represents the extremes of human cruelty and the dangers of conflating justice with spectacle. Yet in the medieval mindset, it was a rational, even necessary, instrument. Law, morality, and social order were inseparable, and the body became the canvas on which justice was painted. The victim's suffering served as a tangible reminder that law transcended individual whims and that divine and secular authorities were inextricably linked. The wheel was a grim affirmation of the prevailing belief. Crime disrupted not only society, but the cosmic and moral order, and punishment restored equilibrium. Closing reflections as we leave the breaking wheel behind. We see a medieval society deeply invested in control, symbolism, and public moral instruction. The wheel transformed the human body into a lesson, the executioner into a teacher, and the community into a witness of justice. The next chapter will explore trial by fire, another form of ordeal where punishment intersected with supernatural belief, divine judgment, and public spectacle. Here again, the medieval imagination used pain, fear, and ritual to enforce law and morality, blending the corporeal with the spiritual in ways both terrifying and mesmerizing. Through these stories, one glimpses the medieval approach to crime and punishment, a world where justice was performed in public, where fear was a tool, and where morality and law were woven into every action and story of human experience. Chapter 11. Trial by Fire. The ordeal of flames. In the shadowed courts and marketplaces of medieval Europe, justice was not merely administered through reason or testimony. It was, at times, a force that burned with literal fire, a ritualized test that fused law, belief, and spectacle. Trial by fire, or the ordeal of flames, represented one of the most chilling intersections of faith, superstition, and punishment, where guilt or innocence was determined by a fiery trial that left both body and soul vulnerable to the flames. Origins of fire trials. The concept of trial by fire stretches back into early medieval and even pre-medieval societies, rooted in the belief that divine power would protect the innocent. If the accused was pure of heart and free from guilt, God would intervene to prevent injury. In a world where forensic science was unknown and suspicion could consume entire villages, the flames became both judge and arbiter. Typically, the ordeal was applied to those accused of serious crimes, theft, heresy, adultery, or even accusations of witchcraft. The accused was compelled to endure contact with fire, often in the form of carrying a heated iron, walking over glowing embers, or being bound and exposed to flames. The outcome, whether burns, blisters, or unharmed passage, was interpreted as divine judgment. Ritual and procedure. The trial by fire was conducted with strict ritualistic rules, blending solemnity, fear, and moral authority. Preparation. The accused often fasted, prayed, or confessed prior to the ordeal. This spiritual preparation reinforced the notion that divine assistance was crucial. Community witnesses. Trials were public events, held in town squares or near the church, where the community could witness the divine verdict. Conduct of the ordeal. The specific method varied. Heated iron. The accused carried or held an iron rod, often glowing from a forge, for a designated distance. Fire walking. Some were required to walk barefoot across embers or stones heated to extreme temperatures. Enclosure in flames. In extreme cases, a structure or platform surrounded the accused with fire, testing endurance and faith. Examination and judgment. After the ordeal, clerics or officials examined the accused for injuries. Minor burns were interpreted as innocence. Severe burns signaled guilt. The procedure was meticulous, blending practicality with religious symbolism. The ritual emphasized both the omnipotence of God and the omnipresence of the law, reinforcing societal obedience. Symbolism and social function. Trial by fire was far more than a test of endurance. It was a moral and psychological instrument. Divine judgment. The flames were seen as God's hand, a supernatural arbiter that bypassed human error. Deterrence. Witnessing the ordeal instilled fear in communities, demonstrating the severe consequences of wrongdoing. Social cohesion. Public ceremonies reaffirmed communal norms, linking religious faith to legal authority. In essence, trial by fire transformed the physical world into a spiritual mirror, reflecting the perceived alignment between morality, guilt, and divine will. The role of clerics played a central role in the ordeal. Their presence legitimized the trial, ensuring that it was interpreted as an act of divine justice, not arbitrary cruelty. Priests might administer blessings, recite prayers, or pronounce the divine verdict. Their authority was essential, as it reinforced the medieval belief that sin, crime, and punishment were intertwined with spiritual truth. Variations across regions. Trial by fire was not uniform. Regional practices differed, In France, heated iron was a common tool, often requiring the accused to walk or carry it for several paces. In Germany, fire walking over embers or sand was more common, with observation and timing critical to the outcome. In England, some trials combined fire with water, integrating dual elements to balance tests of endurance and divine protection. These regional variations highlight the adaptability of medieval justice, where cultural beliefs, local traditions, and religious interpretation shaped the methods of punishment. Cases and historical records detail both extraordinary and tragic outcomes. A peasant accused of theft might emerge with minor blisters, celebrated as vindicated by God. Conversely, accusations of heresy could result in severe burns or death, particularly if authorities sought to make an example of the accused. Chroniclers frequently recorded these events with morbid fascination, describing flaming embers, the tension of waiting, and the reactions of the crowd. Some trials ended tragically, with injuries or death that exceeded the expected punishment, blurring the line between justice and execution. Psychological impact. The ordeal of fire carried profound psychological weight for both the accused and the community. For the accused, fear, anticipation, and spiritual pressure combined with physical pain to create extreme psychological distress. For witnesses, observing the flames reinforced obedience, morality, and the omnipotence of divine authority. For authorities, officials gained social control, using ritualized punishment to stabilize communities and maintain hierarchies. In this way, trial by fire served as both punishment and pedagogy, embedding lessons in the collective consciousness. Intersection with gender and power. While trials by fire were administered to men and women alike, historical records suggest that women were disproportionately accused in cases of adultery, witchcraft, or moral transgression. The ordeal reinforced societal expectations, using both fear and spectacle to control behavior and assert patriarchal power structures. Nobility and clergy often manipulated trials to eliminate rivals or consolidate authority, highlighting the political dimensions of medieval justice. Innocence was not always guaranteed protection. Power, influence, and social standing could shape outcomes, revealing the inequities of the system. Fire as a test of faith. Trial by fire exemplifies the medieval integration of law, morality, and spirituality. The flames symbolized purification, the ordeal a test of both body and soul. Success reinforced the idea that virtue and divine favor were intertwined, while failure signaled moral or spiritual deficiency. Communities internalized these lessons. The flames were not merely destructive, they were narrative devices, communicating societal norms and divine authority to all who watched. Criticism and skepticism. Even in the Middle Ages, some questioned the fairness and morality of fire trials. Skeptics argued that survival depended on physical strength, resilience, or luck, rather than divine judgment. Misinterpretation or manipulation of outcomes could lead to injustice, revealing the human flaws embedded within a system claimed to be guided by God. Nevertheless, trial by fire persisted for centuries, a testament to the enduring belief in the intersection of justice and the supernatural, and the need for tangible demonstrations of divine authority in an often chaotic world. Legacy of trial by fire. Though eventually abandoned, trial by fire left a lasting mark on history, literature, and cultural imagination. Stories of courageous innocents passing through flames or guilty parties scorched by divine justice were retold in chronicles, plays, and folklore. The ritual's symbolism, purification, divine intervention, and moral consequence resonates even in modern reflections on justice, punishment, and morality. The ordeal reminds us that medieval societies sought certainty in an uncertain world, attempting to enforce social order through fear, ritual, and divine symbolism. Fire, both destructive and purifying, became a medium through which morality and authority were performed, observed, and remembered. Closing reflections. As we leave the flames behind, the pattern of medieval punishment becomes clearer. Pain, fear, spectacle, and belief were inseparable tools of justice. Trial by fire illustrates a society in which divine authority and human law were intertwined, where the spectacle of suffering educated the public, and where survival was interpreted as a sign of moral righteousness. In the next chapter, we will explore trial by water, where cold and immersion replaced fire. Yet the same intertwining of faith, fear, and spectacle persisted. Here, the accused faced another physical and spiritual crucible, revealing the medieval commitment to testing guilt and innocence through ritualized endurance. Through these ordeals, one glimpses a world both terrifying and fascinating, a world where justice was performed in public, moralized through suffering, and validated by divine observation, leaving echoes that would persist long after the flames had died. Chapter 12. Trial by Water. The Cold Judgment. In the medieval world, water, like fire, became a medium of both judgment and fear. While trial by fire tested endurance through heat, the trial by water tested resolve and divine favor through cold and immersion. In this ritual, accused individuals faced the physical and spiritual consequences of submersion, held captive by the belief that God himself would reveal innocence or guilt. The ordeal of water, with its quiet menace and deceptive simplicity, left an indelible mark on medieval justice, weaving together superstition, morality, and law. Origins and beliefs. Trial by water has roots that stretch back to early European legal traditions, influenced by Germanic and Celtic customs. Unlike fire, which demanded visible courage and resilience, water tested the accused through weightlessness, cold, and the apparent judgment of the liquid element. It was widely believed that pure water would reject the guilty, causing them to float, while the innocent would sink or emerge unscathed. The logic of this belief inverted natural expectations, creating a world where survival could indicate guilt, and apparent suffering could signify innocence. Water trials were often applied to accusations of witchcraft, heresy, or theft, crimes that threatened not just property but moral or spiritual order. In some regions, women accused of sorcery were the primary subjects, their fate intertwined with both fear of magic and patriarchal control. The method's perceived simplicity masked its terrifying consequences. Drowning was a real and common result, and the ritual demanded both physical endurance and unwavering faith. Methods and rituals. Medieval trials by water varied widely in practice, but shared common elements of procedure and ritual. Preparation. The accused often underwent spiritual preparation, including fasting, confession, or prayer, to gain divine favor. Public display. Trials were performed in public locations, rivers, ponds, wells, or specially constructed tanks, to maximize visibility and enforce communal norms. The ordeal. Two primary forms existed: dunking/immersion. The accused was bound, typically with hands and feet tied, and lowered into water. Floating was seen as a sign of guilt, sinking as innocence. Submersion. Objects. Sometimes, accused individuals were required to hold or carry objects underwater or balance upon floating devices while immersed, testing endurance and composure. Examination and verdict. Observers, often including clergy and local officials, judged the outcome. Survival, injury, or behavior under duress determined whether one was deemed guilty or innocent. The ritual emphasized the authority of both natural and divine law, transforming a simple element into an instrument of fear and control. Symbolism of water. Water carried multiple layers of symbolism in the Middle Ages. Purity and cleansing. Submersion represented a spiritual cleansing, washing away sin and testing the soul's truth. Judgment and retribution. Floating or struggling was interpreted as divine condemnation, a visible sign of moral failing. Transition and trial. Water symbolized a liminal space between accusation and verdict, life and death, human justice and divine will. In communities steeped in religion and superstition, water trials reinforced the notion that crime and sin could not escape divine scrutiny, and that human eyes alone could not determine truth. Gender and social dimensions. Trials by water disproportionately targeted women, often accused of witchcraft, adultery, or moral transgression. These accusations were rarely neutral. They reflected societal fears of female independence, sexuality, and influence. The ritual provided both a public warning and a mechanism of control, ensuring compliance with patriarchal and moral norms. Men were not exempt, particularly in cases of theft, heresy, or challenges to authority. But records indicate that women were more vulnerable to accusations where morality, superstition, and gender intersected, drowning or survival. Interpreting the outcome of a water trial was often counterintuitive. Floating was interpreted as guilt, believed to demonstrate divine rejection. Sinking, which carried obvious physical risk, signaled innocence. Some towns used ropes or nets to rescue the sinking accused, while others allowed nature to decide. This paradox created intense anxiety for the accused and suspense for spectators. Survival did not always guarantee safety, as physical injury, hypothermia, or pre-existing frailty could affect results. Communities often rationalized tragic outcomes as divine will, reinforcing faith while masking human error. The role of clergy and local authorities played critical roles in trials by water. Priests blessed the waters, recited prayers, and interpreted results, while judges and bailiffs managed logistics and witnessed outcomes. Their presence lent legitimacy, ensuring that the ordeal was considered an extension of divine law, not arbitrary cruelty. The public and performative nature of the ritual reinforced social hierarchies and the interweaving of faith and law. Psychological impact. The trial by water was psychologically devastating. For the accused, fear of drowning, humiliation, and divine judgment combined into overwhelming terror. For the community, spectators internalized moral lessons, witnessing the consequences of transgression and the power of divine justice. For authorities, officials solidified their control and reinforced societal norms through the spectacle of fear. This ritual functioned not only as punishment, but as a tool of social conditioning, teaching obedience and reinforcing hierarchy. Regional variations. Water trials varied geographically. In England, accused witches were often tied and dunked into ponds, sometimes with weighted ropes to ensure complete immersion. In France, rivers and wells were commonly used, emphasizing natural and spiritual connection. In Germany, the swimming test for women involved elaborate rituals where floating indicated guilt, often with communal oversight to enforce public morality. These differences reflect local customs, the influence of folklore, and the practicalities of available water sources. But the underlying principle, divine judgment through immersion, remained constant. Intersection with politics and power. Trial by water could be manipulated for political or social ends. Local lords or clergy could accuse rivals, competitors, or inconvenient individuals, using the ritual to eliminate threats under the guise of divine justice. Outcomes could be tailored through pretrial preparation, manipulation of bindings, or careful monitoring, showing that even rituals claiming divine authority were vulnerable to human interference. That long-term consequences, though eventually abandoned. Trial by water left a lasting legacy. Stories of miraculous survival or tragic drowning were recorded in chronicles, religious texts, and folklore. The ritual shaped public perceptions of justice, morality, and divine power. It reinforced fear and obedience, creating a society deeply conditioned by spectacle and belief. Trial by water reminds us that medieval justice was never purely legal, but inseparable from faith, superstition, and social order. It was a test not just of guilt or innocence, but of endurance, character, and alignment with divine will. Closing reflections. As the accused emerged, sopping, shivering, trembling, or triumphant, the water left an indelible mark on both body and society. Communities internalized the lessons of the ordeal, that divine oversight was constant, that crime and sin carried consequences, and that survival or suffering was a reflection of moral and spiritual truth. In the next chapter, we will explore trial by combat, where physical strength, skill, and luck determined fate in the arena, blending justice with martial prowess. Like fire and water, these trials reveal a medieval world in which law, belief, and human imagination were inseparable, shaping society through spectacle, fear, and ritualized challenge. The ordeal of water, cold and unyielding, exemplifies the medieval commitment to divine justice, reminding us that in a world without scientific certainty, faith and fear were the instruments of law. Chapter 13. Trial by combat. Steel and justice. In the medieval world, justice was often intertwined with strength, skill, and the brutal reality of human conflict. The trial by combat, also known as judicial duel or wager of battle, was a legal practice that allowed disputes to be settled through armed confrontation. Unlike ordeals by fire or water, which relied on divine judgment, trial by combat tested physical prowess, courage, and endurance, with the belief that God would favor the righteous. The battlefield became a courtroom, the sort of witness, and the outcome a verdict written in blood. Origins and legal foundations. Trial by combat traces its roots to Germanic and Frankish customs, later adopted across England, France, and other parts of medieval Europe. By the 9th and 10th centuries, these duels were formally recognized in legal codes, often employed to resolve accusations of theft, treason, or personal injury when evidence was insufficient or witnesses unavailable. The principle was simple. God's will would manifest through victory, demonstrating innocence or guilt. Kings and local lords codified these duels, sometimes creating elaborate rules to ensure fairness. Combatants could be armed or unarmed, fight in full armor or with ceremonial weapons, depending on the nature of the accusation and their social standing. Nobles often had access to swords, shields, and armor, while peasants might rely on clubs or axes, making the contest both a test of skill and social advantage. Structure and procedure. Trials by combat followed ritualized procedures designed to balance law and spectacle, challenge and acceptance. The accused or the accuser could issue a formal challenge. If refused, the refusing party could be judged guilty by default, sometimes losing property or status. Selection of weapons. Weapons were often standardized according to rank and offense. Nobles might duel with swords or lances, while commoners fought with sticks or daggers. Shields, helmets, and armor were sometimes mandatory, but rules varied regionally. Formal oaths. Before combat, both parties swore oaths affirming the truth of their claims and invoking God as witness. Clergy often oversaw this process, emphasizing the spiritual weight of the duel. The combat. The duel could be fought to submission, injury, or death. Sometimes seconds or assistants intervened to maintain fairness. Crowds gathered to witness, making each duel both a legal procedure and public spectacle. Judgment by outcome. Victory indicated innocence or righteousness, while defeat implied guilt. In cases of death, the survivor's honor was affirmed, and the accused's reputation was destroyed, sometimes literally. This combination of ritual, law, and spectacle transformed combat into a theater of justice, reinforcing societal hierarchies, religious faith, and community oversight. Social and political implications. Trial by combat was more than a legal procedure. It was a reflection of medieval values and power structures. Physical strength, martial skill, and social status played critical roles in determining outcomes. Nobles were often favored, as their training and resources gave them an advantage, while peasants or lower classes risked brutal defeat. Political intrigue could also influence duels. Local lords might sponsor or intervene, ensuring that a favored party emerged victorious. In some regions, duels were used to intimidate opponents, settle feuds, or assert dominance over rival factions. Victory in combat carried not only legal weight, but also social and political prestige, making trial by combat a multi-layered instrument of control, gender, and combat. While primarily a male domain, historical records indicate that women occasionally participated in trials by combat, though rarely as primary combatants. Widows, heiresses, or women accused of serious crimes could rely on champions or representatives to fight on their behalf, blending agency with societal restriction. Female champions were exceptional, their involvement demonstrating both courage and the flexibility of legal practices in extreme circumstances. Psychological dimensions. The psychological stakes of trial by combat were immense. For the accused, fear of injury or death compounded the stress of public judgment. Mental fortitude was as crucial as physical ability, and superstitions about divine favor could influence performance. For the community, spectators internalized moral lessons and social norms, learning that strength and righteousness were intertwined, and that divine oversight manifested visibly through victory. For the authorities, judges, clergy, and lords enforced social hierarchy and legitimacy, demonstrating that law could operate through spectacle, not just decree. This mixture of terror, anticipation, and public scrutiny made trial by combat an unforgettable experience for all involved. Weapons and tactics varied with social class, region, and the specific rules of the duel. Swords and axes, common among nobles, often paired with shields or armor. Spears and lances, used in mounted duels, emphasizing horsemanship and reach. Daggers and clubs, accessible to peasants and commoners, prioritizing endurance and cleverness over sheer skill. Armor and helmets provided protection, though mobility often became a critical factor in determining victory. Combatants trained not just for strength, but also for strategy, exploiting terrain, positioning, and psychological intimidation. Success depended on timing, precision, and the ability to remain calm under extreme stress. Famous trials by combat medieval chronicles recount numerous notable duels. In England, judicial duels often settled disputes between knights, with the king's consent required for high-profile cases. In France, noble rivals fought to resolve inheritance claims, turning personal vendettas into legally sanctioned combat. Across Germany and Italy, duels could determine accusations of witchcraft, treason, or murder, reinforcing the idea that physical victory equated to moral and legal legitimacy. Each duel was a microcosm of medieval society, hierarchy, faith, and justice intertwined in a violent ballet of human skill and divine oversight. Intersection with religion clergy frequently officiated trials by combat, invoking divine witness and blessing the weapons. The duel was more than physical. It was a spiritual contest, a test of righteousness where God was expected to intervene. Victory was interpreted as proof of innocence and moral alignment, reinforcing the Church's role in societal judgment. The spiritual dimension extended to superstition. Combatants might pray, carry charms, or perform rituals to ensure divine favor. Spectators, likewise, saw the duel as moral instruction, observing that courage, skill, and faith were inseparable in the pursuit of justice. Risks and consequences. Trial by combat was inherently dangerous. Injuries ranged from minor cuts to permanent disability, and death was common. The accused often faced physical vulnerability, especially if untrained, while even skilled combatants risked misfortune or unfair advantage. The aftermath could include public humiliation, social ostracism, or political loss, yet the risk reinforced the perceived fairness of divine judgment. Communities accepted that God's will could manifest through the outcome, creating a powerful blend of fear, awe, and respect for law. Decline and legacy. Trial by combat gradually declined by the late medieval period as legal evidence, documentation, and secular courts grew in prominence. Monarchs and judges began favoring structured investigation over physical contests. Yet its legacy endured. The concept of honor-based justice influenced chivalric culture and medieval martial ideals. Chronicles, literature, and folklore immortalized famous duels, emphasizing courage, faith, and moral fortitude. Legal traditions in some regions maintained vestiges of combat-based resolution for centuries, showing the lasting impact of ritualized violence in societal order. Trial by combat reminds us that in the medieval imagination, justice was not merely an abstraction, it was embodied, performative, and inseparable from divine will. Victory, blood, and endurance were intertwined with morality and law, creating a society where strength, skill, and righteousness determined the course of lives and the fate of communities. Closing reflections. The duel of steel, the clash of shields, and the roar of the crowd made trial by combat a dramatic, terrifying, and deeply meaningful instrument of justice. It reflected the medieval belief that God would favor the just, that morality and physical skill were inseparable, and that the spectacle of law could teach obedience, fear, and honor simultaneously. As we move forward, the next chapter will examine unusual and cruel punishments, exploring how creativity and fear combine to enforce obedience and moral order. Like fire, water, and combat, these punishments reveal a medieval world in which law, ritual, and imagination shaped every aspect of human experience. Chapter 14. Instruments of Horror, Torture Devices, and Psychological Fear. Medieval justice was as much a performance as a system of law. while trials by fire, water, and combat determined guilt through divine or martial judgment. The instruments of torture reflected a more calculated, deliberate, and sinister approach. They were designed not only to punish but to extract confessions, intimidate communities, and reinforce the omnipotence of authority. Each device, whether metal, wood, or chain, carried both physical and psychological weight, a symbol of the consequences of defiance and the fragility of the human body. The philosophy of pain. The use of torture in the Middle Ages was rationalized by a combination of law, faith, and superstition. Authorities believed that truth could be coerced from the body, that suffering purified the soul, and that terror instilled obedience. Pain became a language of justice, a direct way to communicate both to the accused and to the watching community. Monarchs, lords, and ecclesiastical leaders shared the understanding that punishment must be visible, memorable, and instructive. A public execution or torture session served as a warning, ensuring that potential criminals internalized the risks of transgression. Beyond physical punishment, the psychological terror was central. The accused was isolated, stripped of dignity, and made painfully aware of mortality. Common torture devices. The rack, perhaps the most infamous. The rack consisted of a wooden frame with ropes attached to the hands and feet. Victims were stretched until joints dislocated, a method both excruciating and visible. Confessions extracted under this method were considered reliable, as the body betrayed secrets the mind might withhold. The iron chair, constructed of metal and sometimes lined with spikes, the chair immobilized the accused and inflicted pain over extended periods. Often heated, it combined physical agony with psychological terror, emphasizing helplessness. The pillory and stocks, though less lethal, these devices humiliated offenders publicly, exposing them to ridicule, mockery, and sometimes physical assault from passers-by. They served as both punishment and social instruction, reinforcing communal norms. The wheel, reserved for the most severe crimes, this device shattered bones while leaving the body on public display. Victims endured prolonged agony, sometimes for hours or days, their suffering a stark warning to all who observed. Thumbscrews and finger cages, small but cruel, these devices applied crushing pressure to digits, producing intense pain and permanent damage. Often used to extract confessions or coerce information, they were particularly effective because the pain was sharp, localized, and psychologically suffocating. The strappato, victims were hung by the wrists, often with weights attached to the ankles, causing dislocation and intense strain on the arms and shoulders. This method combined physical agony with exposure, sometimes in public, magnifying the humiliation and fear. Psychological aspects. Torture was not merely about inflicting physical pain. It was designed to reshape perception, obedience, and compliance. Victims were often subjected to long periods of anticipation, sleepless nights, isolation, and threats before the actual device was applied. Fear became a tool as potent as the implements themselves. The mind was weaponized, creating terror that outlasted the session and sometimes haunted survivors for life. Community psychology also played a role. Spectators, including family and neighbors, internalized the consequences of criminality, learning obedience through the suffering of others. The medieval justice system relied heavily on this social theater of punishment, where pain, fear, and moral instruction were intertwined. Torture and the church. The ecclesiastical authorities wielded torture primarily to extract confessions of heresy, witchcraft, or moral transgression. The church justified these methods as necessary to save souls, interpreting confession as a path to redemption. Devices like the rack and the strappato were often used under ecclesiastical supervision, demonstrating that torture was both a tool of law and a spiritual instrument of authority. Clergy often framed the agony as divinely sanctioned, reinforcing the idea that sin manifested through suffering. This theological rationale intensified fear, making victims believe that endurance or confession was intertwined with eternal destiny. Case studies and chronicles. Medieval chronicles are replete with examples of torture used to enforce social order and religious orthodoxy. Witch trials. Accused witches were subjected to crushing, stretching, and water-based tests, designed to break both body and spirit. Confessions often involved accusations against neighbors, fueling cycles of fear and persecution. Political prisoners, rivals to kings and lords, faced tortures that forced compliance or eliminated threats. Chroniclers described elaborate sessions, often as public spectacles, to warn others of rebellion's consequences. Heretical dissenters, those challenging church doctrine, might endure prolonged torment, often intertwined with public humiliation, demonstrating the church's control over belief, body, and soul. The records show that pain was strategic, not chaotic. Authorities used it selectively, balancing public intimidation with legal procedure, aiming to maximize compliance while maintaining order. Innovations in design torture devices evolved over centuries, blending mechanical ingenuity with sadistic creativity. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and inventors contributed to increasingly sophisticated instruments. Mechanisms allowed precise adjustment of pressure, ensuring maximum agony with minimal effort. Visual design served as deterrent. Spikes, chains, and cages were as much psychological as functional tools. Public placement reinforced authority, reminding citizens that law enforcement was both omnipresent and inescapable. These innovations reflected the medieval mindset that pain could teach, purify, and preserve order, merging craftsmanship with cruelty. Social and cultural implications. Torture reinforced hierarchy. Nobles might avoid direct exposure to devices, while peasants and commoners were more likely to experience public punishment. Yet the threat of torture permeated all levels of society, creating a pervasive atmosphere of caution, fear, and moral vigilance. Cultural norms also supported the practice. Literature, theater, and folklore depicted suffering as a natural consequence of sin and transgression, normalizing the presence of torture in daily life. Pain was not merely punitive but didactic, teaching obedience, deterring crime, and reinforcing belief systems. The decline of torture by the late medieval and early modern periods. Legal reforms, emerging humanist thought, and the evolution of evidence-based courts began to curtail the use of torture. Philosophers questioned the morality and reliability of confessions obtained under duress. Scientific and legal rationality gradually replaced fear as a means of enforcement. Yet the legacy of torture devices endures in historical memory. Museum displays and literature, reflecting a time when law, fear, and craftsmanship intertwined to shape behavior. Closing reflections. Medieval torture devices were more than instruments. They were symbols of authority, fear, and societal order. From the rack to the iron chair, each mechanism represented a calculated fusion of psychology, physical punishment, and public spectacle. Communities learned through observation, victims endured for survival, and authorities reinforced hierarchies with every device employed. As we drift through the history of trial by fire, water, combat, and the dark art of torture, it becomes clear that medieval justice was as theatrical as it was brutal. The devices were not merely tools, they were messages, warnings, and instruments of societal control, reflecting the profound and sometimes terrifying logic of a world ruled by law, faith, and fear. In the next chapter, we will explore criminal psychology and the minds behind the crimes, revealing not only the tools of punishment, but the human motivations that made medieval crime both pervasive and unforgettable. Chapter 15: Flames of Justice. Fire and its role in medieval trials and punishments. Fire in the Middle Ages was a force both revered and feared. It provided warmth, cooked food, and illuminated darkened halls. Yet it was equally a weapon, a tool of purification, and a symbol of divine judgment. In the context of crime and punishment, fire assumed a particularly chilling role. From accusations of heresy and witchcraft to political transgressions, flames became the ultimate arbiter of guilt, a visible, inescapable manifestation of justice. It was in fire that the medieval imagination fused morality, authority, and terror, creating spectacles designed to awe and intimidate entire communities. The symbolism of fire was considered both destructive and purifying. Ecclesiastical authorities believed that burning a sinner could purge the soul of sin, ensuring that justice extended beyond the material world. Heretics, witches, and blasphemers were not merely punished for earthly crimes. The flames were believed to cleanse the soul, sparing the living from their spiritual contamination. In this sense, Fire was a bridge between the temporal and the divine, a mechanism of punishment that transcended ordinary legal or corporal methods, beyond its spiritual symbolism. Fire was also a tool of public demonstration. Bonfires, pyres, and torches drew spectators from surrounding villages, creating an atmosphere of communal participation in justice. Witnessing the flames consume a criminal reinforced the authority of rulers, clergy, and local magistrates. The fire was not only the instrument of death, but also a warning encoded in light and smoke. Lingering in memory long after the flames subsided, trials by fire was central to several medieval trial practices, particularly in cases where guilt was disputed or evidence was uncertain. The most common forms included ordeals by fire. These trials required the accused to endure direct contact with fire or hot objects. They might carry red-hot iron, walk barefoot over embers, or hold burning objects for specified periods. Survival or the pattern of injury was interpreted as divine judgment, revealing innocence or guilt. Clerics often oversaw these trials, interpreting results according to theological and customary principles. Pyres for heresy. Individuals convicted of heresy or blasphemy were often sentenced to death by burning. Unlike ordeals, this was a deliberate execution, performed publicly to demonstrate the consequences of defying church authority. The condemned might be strangled or bound before flames consumed the body, reflecting a mixture of mercy, ritual, and spectacle. Witchcraft executions. Accusations of sorcery were widespread, particularly in late medieval Europe. Those accused of consorting with the devil or casting malevolent spells were burned to prevent further spiritual corruption. Testimonies were often coerced, and the flames were both a tool of punishment and a societal deterrent, reinforcing communal norms and fears. Fire trials were not solely punitive, they were performative. Every detail, from the construction of the pyre to the procession of the condemned, was choreographed to instill awe, terror, and obedience. Villagers learned, through spectacle, that divine authority and human law were intertwined, and that transgression carried consequences far beyond the immediate psychological impact. The threat of fire cast a long shadow over medieval communities. The knowledge that heresy, theft, or moral transgression could result in immolation created an ever-present psychological tension, shaping behavior and social norms. Fire was a constant reminder of mortality, morality, and hierarchy. It communicated a message far beyond the individual. Sin and crime endangered not only oneself, but the collective well-being of the community. For the accused, anticipation often caused as much terror as the flames themselves. Months of investigation, threats of execution, and public shaming preceded the moment of immolation. The psychological dimension was crucial. Fear amplified compliance, confession, and social control. Fire thus operated as both a literal and metaphorical instrument of authority, demonstrating the reach of law and faith. Methods and variations. The application of fire in medieval punishment varied widely. Bonfires and pyres. Victims might be tied to a stake, surrounded by wood and kindling, with the fire gradually ignited. Flames consumed clothing, then flesh, producing a slow, public spectacle. Conflagration in dungeons. Less common but equally terrifying, fires were sometimes lit in confined spaces to suffocate or burn the condemned. Ceremonial torch processions. Before immolation, the condemned could be paraded through the town, torches held high, announcing guilt and reinforcing communal fear. The methodology was deliberate. Fire's unpredictability required skill in construction, timing, and supervision. Authorities ensured that punishment was both effective and emblematic, maximizing visibility while asserting control. Famous cases. Medieval chronicles record numerous cases where fire was central to punishment. The burning of heretics. Individuals challenging church orthodoxy were executed in town squares, sometimes after long inquisitorial trials. Chroniclers describe flames consuming the bodies, emphasizing both divine justice and social order. Witch hunts. Particularly in later medieval periods, accused witches were burned in mass executions. These events were publicized, creating fear and ensuring societal conformity. Political punishment. Fire was occasionally used against traitors or rivals to demonstrate the power of kings or lords. Such executions were carefully staged, ensuring the symbolic authority of flames reinforced political dominance. Each case reflects the dual role of fire. It punished the individual and instructed the society, embedding lessons of obedience, morality, and faith deep within the cultural psyche. Integration with other punishments. Fire was often combined with other forms of punishment to intensify suffering or ritual significance. Stripping and public humiliation. Victims might be paraded naked or with identifying marks, heightening shame before death. Confinement and starvation. Prisoners awaiting immolation endured long periods of deprivation, enhancing psychological terror. Accompaniments of ritual and prayer. Clerics often recited scripture, exhorting the condemned to repentance and reinforcing the moral framework of execution. Through these combinations, fire became a comprehensive instrument of discipline, blending physical pain, psychological terror, and religious instruction. Fire and society. The spectacle of burning shaped public consciousness. Communities internalized fear through observation, learning the consequences of defiance and moral transgression. Festivals, sermons, and chronicles reinforced the symbolism, embedding fire in the cultural imagination as both punishment and purification. The collective experience of watching flames consume a human life created enduring social lessons. Generations grew up witnessing or hearing of immolations, internalizing obedience, faith, and social hierarchy. Fire, in this sense, was a medium of medieval pedagogy, teaching compliance through visceral, unforgettable experience. Decline and legacy. As Europe transitioned into the Renaissance and early modern era, legal reforms, humanist thought, and skepticism about divine judgment gradually reduced the use of fire in trials. The rise of secular courts and evidence-based procedures replaced spectacle with rational adjudication. However, the legacy of flames in medieval justice endures. Chroniclers, literature, and surviving accounts preserve the terror and authority of fire, providing insight into a society where pain, spectacle, and morality were inseparable. Fire remains emblematic of the medieval imagination, a tool of divine justice, social control, and human terror. Its flames burn not just flesh but authority, morality, and memory into the collective consciousness, leaving a shadow that lingers in history and storytelling alike. Closing reflections. In medieval Europe, fire was never neutral. It was power, pedagogy, and terror distilled into a single force. Punishments by fire were designed to control, terrify, and instruct, a vivid manifestation of a society where law, faith, and morality were inseparable. The image of flames consuming the condemned remains a potent reminder of the medieval mind, a world where justice was performative, sin was visible, and survival depended on obedience and faith. As we move forward, we will examine trials by water and other elemental tests, exploring how medieval authorities used the natural world itself as a medium of judgment, punishment, and social control. Chapter 16. The Cold Verdict. Trials by water and their terrifying logic. Water in the Middle Ages was as vital as it was feared. Essential for life, yet unpredictable and dangerous, it became an instrument of both survival and judgment. The methodical use of water in medieval trials, sometimes called trial by water or ordeal by water, reveals a society deeply entangled with belief, ritual, and terror. Unlike fire, which punished through flames and spectacle, water tested, probed, and revealed guilt or innocence through immersion, exposure, or manipulation, all under the watchful eyes of authorities convinced of divine intervention. Ordeals of water. The practice of using water as a judicial instrument had deep roots in medieval Europe, extending back to ancient Germanic and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Water was not only practical but sacred. It was thought to possess purifying qualities, to separate the innocent from the guilty, and to reveal divine will. Trials by water took several forms. Cold water ordeal. The accused, often accused of theft, sorcery, or adultery, would be immersed in cold water. Survival or buoyancy was interpreted as a sign of innocence, while sinking or inability to float indicated guilt. Clerics or local judges oversaw the proceedings, invoking prayers and blessings before the test, ensuring that the outcome reflected divine judgment rather than human judgment alone. Boiling water ordeal. Though less common than cold water immersion, some trials involve placing a hand or arm into boiling water. The injury and subsequent healing of the wound served as proof of guilt or innocence, with rapid healing interpreted as a divine signal of purity. Trial by water for witchcraft. Accusations of witchcraft sometimes led to the infamous swimming tests. The accused, usually women, were bound and thrown into rivers or ponds. Floating was considered proof of guilt, as the water supposedly rejected the innocent and welcomed the guilty. The logic, though horrifying by modern standards, was rooted in the medieval belief in divine intervention and spiritual truth. Water trials were as much performance as judgment. The act of immersion, the ritual prayers, the onlookers, all created a communal experience where justice was witnessed, internalized, and remembered. Failure or survival carried weight not only for the accused, but for the entire village or town. The role of the church ecclesiastical authorities played a significant role in water trials, particularly when accusations involved heresy, sorcery, or moral transgression. Priests, monks, or inquisitors would oversee the procedure, ensuring that rituals were observed and divine will invoked. Blessings, holy water, and invocations of saints were commonplace, lending spiritual legitimacy to what might otherwise seem arbitrary. The church's influence extended beyond the trial itself. Even after a verdict, the accused might be subjected to penance, confession, or other spiritual acts. Punishment, when administered, was not only physical but also moral and spiritual. This duality reinforced the inseparability of sin, crime, and divine judgment in medieval society. Psychological dimensions. Trials by water were terrifying, both in anticipation and execution. The accused often faced hypothermia, drowning, or brutal injury, and the public nature of the trial added immense psychological pressure. The fear of death or humiliation ensured compliance and confession, making the ordeal a powerful tool of social control. Witnesses internalized the stakes of crime and sin, learning that transgression could lead to pain, shame, or eternal damnation. For communities, the trial served as both spectacle and warning. Water, usually associated with cleansing and life, was transformed into a medium of judgment and terror. The duality reinforced the medieval worldview that everyday elements could be manipulated to reveal divine truth, and that justice was inseparable from morality, ritual, and fear. Famous water ordeals. Historical records offer chilling accounts of water trials, witch swimming tests. In various European villages, women accused of witchcraft were tied and thrown into rivers. The terror of drowning, coupled with public scrutiny, created a climate of fear that reinforced social norms and the power of local authorities. The cold water ordeals in England. Anglo-Saxon and later English law employed cold water immersion as a test of guilt. The church often supervised these trials, ensuring that outcomes reflected divine judgment, even if the methods were physically perilous. Accusations of theft and treason. Water trials were sometimes employed for common crimes when evidence was insufficient. The outcome, interpreted as a sign from God, determined the accused's fate in ways that modern courts would find shocking. Each instance of water trial reflects a society where natural elements were harnessed as instruments of divine judgment, where fear and faith intersected, and where justice was as much spiritual as it was earthly. Integration with other punishments. Water trials were rarely isolated from other forms of medieval justice. The condemned might face public humiliation before or after immersion. Accused individuals could be paraded through the village, exposed to ridicule, reinforcing communal values. Physical punishment. Whippings, shackles, or marks might accompany the ordeal, ensuring the physical consequences of transgression were visible. Spiritual penances, confession, fasting, or pilgrimages often followed trials, linking physical suffering with moral and spiritual lessons. This integration ensured that the trial of water was holistic, impacting mind, body, and community perception. It was not merely about determining guilt. It was about enforcing social, moral, and religious order. Symbolism and cultural impact. Water, like fire, carried immense symbolic weight in medieval culture. Rivers, lakes, and wells were seen as sacred, liminal spaces capable of both life-giving and destructive powers. Ordeals by water tapped into these beliefs, transforming natural elements into instruments of judgment. The psychological and cultural impact was significant. Stories of miraculous survival, divine punishment, and communal justice were shared widely, forming a cultural memory of fear, obedience, and spiritual accountability. Through water trials, society reinforced the idea that divine and human law were inseparable, and that transgression could not hide from scrutiny. Decline and legacy. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, skepticism about ordeals grew. Legal reforms, rationalist thought, and reliance on evidence-based trials reduced the use of water as a judicial instrument. Nonetheless, the legacy of water trials persists in folklore, literature, and historical memory. They reflect a society in which natural elements were deeply entwined with law, morality, and supernatural belief. A society where even water could judge the soul. The dramatic, terrifying logic of water trials continues to fascinate modern audiences, providing a window into the medieval mind. It shows how fear, faith, and ritual were harnessed to maintain order, how communal values were enforced through spectacle, and how justice extended beyond the material to the spiritual realm. Closing reflections. Trials by water were more than punishment. They were performances of morality, religion, and authority. They reveal a society where law, faith, and fear were inseparable, where survival depended not only on action but on divine favor, and where natural elements were transformed into instruments of judgment. As we move to subsequent chapters, we will explore trials by combat and other extraordinary methods, where the medieval imagination continued to blend risk, ritual, and divine oversight. Water, fire, and other elements remind us that justice in the Middle Ages was a complex, terrifying, and deeply human phenomenon, a blend of authority, belief, and performance. Chapter 17. The Trial by Combat, Steel, Honor, and Survival. In the medieval imagination, justice was often inseparable from valor, strength, and divine will. Where evidence was inconclusive, witnesses unreliable, and confessions uncertain, the sword became the arbiter of truth. Trial by combat, or judicial duel, was more than a contest of arms. It was a theatrical expression of law, faith, and honor. It reflected a society where physical courage was intertwined with morality, where personal skill could sway the judgment of God, and where the outcomes of violence carried the weight of law. Origins of the judicial duel. Trial by combat traces its roots to Germanic tribal customs, later codified in Frankish and English legal systems. In a time when formal courts struggled to establish evidence or impartiality, combat offered a seemingly impartial solution. The belief was that God would favor the righteous. If a person was innocent, divine providence would guide them to victory. If guilty, defeat was a sign of divine judgment. Combatants were not chosen lightly. They were often warriors, nobles, or trained knights, though in some instances, champions could be appointed to fight on behalf of those unable to wield a sword. The duels served as a public spectacle, blending legal procedure with ritualized combat, ensuring that the community witnessed the enforcement of justice, rituals, and formalities. A trial by combat was steeped in ceremony. Participants were brought to the dueling ground, sometimes within the courtyard of a castle, a town square, or a specially designated area known as the judicial field. Clerics and legal officials presided over the proceedings, ensuring the ritual was conducted properly. Weapons were inspected, armor examined, and combatants swore oaths of fairness and honor. Heralds announced the charges and recited the names of witnesses. Before the fight began, prayers were offered, seeking God's guidance. The combatants, sometimes armored knights and sometimes ordinary men, were acutely aware that the duel was as much a spiritual trial as a physical one. Victory was seen as divine endorsement, defeat, a sign of guilt. Types of judicial combat. Trials by combat could take several forms, depending on local custom and the status of the participants. Single combat. The accused and accuser fought directly, usually until one party was incapacitated or yielded. This was the most straightforward and symbolic method of determining guilt or innocence. Champion combat. When a noble or the accused could not fight, a champion could be appointed. This allowed for social hierarchies to be maintained while still adhering to the ritualized framework of justice. Prearranged duel. Sometimes, combatants agreed to meet at a set time with established rules. Weapons, armor, and boundaries were defined in advance, creating a quasi-sporting aspect alongside the judicial function. Combat was governed by strict rules. Strikes to certain areas were prohibited, and surrender could be allowed under specific circumstances. Yet despite regulation, death or serious injury was common, underscoring the lethal seriousness of medieval justice. The role of honor and reputation trial by combat was deeply entwined with notions of honor. Nobles, knights, and warriors saw their personal integrity, family name, and social standing at stake. Even when fighting on behalf of another, the champion's skill and courage could reflect on the reputation of their patron. Victory not only exonerated the accused, but also enhanced the social standing of the victor. Conversely, defeat could ruin reputations, regardless of guilt or innocence. This focus on honor made judicial duels both legal proceedings and moral dramas. Communities observed the combatants, not only to witness the outcome, but also to judge character, courage, and divine favor. The duel became a mirror reflecting societal ideals of bravery, loyalty, and justice. Notable historical examples. Historical chronicles preserve chilling accounts of trial by combat. Henry II of England in the feud of 1170s. Knights representing both parties in a violent dispute were ordered to duel. The victor's divine favor was taken as proof of righteousness, quelling potential rebellion and reinforcing royal authority. German judicial duels. In medieval Germany, judicial duels were codified and detailed in legal texts. Rituals were meticulous, and victories were celebrated as both legal and spiritual triumphs. Records describe participants fighting with swords, maces, or even daggers, with outcomes often influencing broader political events. Champion duels for peasants. In rare cases, the poor or those unable to fight might hire a skilled combatant to act as a champion. These instances highlight the intersection of social status, economic capacity, and medieval justice. The duel became a mechanism to navigate the rigid hierarchies of society while still invoking divine judgment. The psychological weight facing a trial by combat was a harrowing experience. The accused confronted the prospect of death, pain, and public humiliation. Fear, adrenaline, and faith intertwined as combatants awaited the starting signal. For witnesses, the duel was a lesson in courage and morality. Communities internalized the message. Crime, dishonor, and sin were matters of both law and divine scrutiny. Even for the victor, the duel carried psychological weight. While triumph brought exoneration, it also reinforced the precarious balance between violence, legality, and morality. The outcome could seal destinies, spark revenge, or cement alliances, showing that judicial combat was as much political theater as legal procedure. Decline of judicial duels by the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Trial by combat declined, supplanted by evidence-based legal systems, professional judges, and secular courts. Skepticism about divine intervention, combined with rising literacy and documentation, reduced reliance on brute force as a determinant of truth. Yet the legacy of judicial duels persisted in literature, folklore, and cultural memory. The idea that God might choose a champion to vindicate truth continued to fascinate and terrify, reflecting enduring tensions between faith, morality, and violence. Integration with medieval justice. Trial by combat was rarely the sole mechanism of justice. It often existed alongside ordeals by water and fire, physical trials that tested divine favor in other forms, public punishment and humiliation, stocks, pillories, and shaming rituals reinforced communal norms. Ecclesiastical oversight. Clergy ensured that combat respected moral and spiritual dimensions, linking martial victory to divine will. This integration illustrates that medieval justice was multidimensional, blending law, faith, violence, and spectacle into a cohesive system that governed both body and soul, cultural and symbolic significance beyond legality. Trial by combat held profound symbolic weight. It communicated divine judgment. Victory confirmed innocence. Defeat indicated guilt. Community cohesion. Public observation reinforced social order and moral lessons. Human courage and agency. While divine favor was paramount, personal skill, bravery, and strategy shaped outcomes that in medieval consciousness. The duel was both legal resolution and moral theater. It dramatized the tension between human action and divine will, providing a narrative framework that explained misfortune, vindication, and justice in ways the ordinary courtroom could not. Closing Reflections Trial by Combat embodies the intersection of fear, faith, and authority. It reminds us that medieval society valued courage, ritual, and divine oversight, often more than procedural fairness. The spectacle of steel clashing, the cries of combatants, and the silent prayers of observers transformed justice into an immersive, terrifying, and morally charged experience. As we move into subsequent chapters, we will explore other extraordinary methods of judgment, such as symbolic trials, ordeals of fire, and psychological punishments. Each technique reflects a society grappling with the unknown, balancing fear, ritual, and justice in a world where survival often depended on divine will and human valor. Chapter 18. Trial by Ordeal, Fire, Water, and the Test of Divine Will. In the medieval mind, the world was governed not only by kings, lords, and knights, but by divine authority. Justice was not always measured by human evidence or reason. It could also be determined by the direct judgment of God. When courts could not determine guilt through testimony, inspection, or trial by combat, the accused might face the ultimate test, the ordeal. Ordeals were ritualized, often terrifying tests by fire or water, designed to reveal truth through divine intervention. These trials were predicated on the belief that God would protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The accused, whether a peasant accused of theft or a noble charged with treason, was subjected to physical extremes. The outcome, whether injury, survival, or death, was interpreted as a divine verdict. The ordeal by fire was both symbolic and brutally physical. The accused might be required to hold a hot iron, walk barefoot across burning coals, or endure a searing touch on their body. Following the trial, priests or officials would inspect the wounds. A clean or minimally injured hand was seen as a sign of innocence. Burns, blisters, or severe injury indicated guilt. The ordeal was conducted with meticulous ceremony. Clerics recited prayers, invoking divine protection. The accused often fasted or performed ritual purification before the test. Despite the danger, participation was compulsory, and refusal could itself be interpreted as admission of guilt. Spectators watched in awe and terror, witnessing the raw intersection of faith, courage, and fate. Fire, with its destructive and purifying symbolism, served as an extension of divine will. Flames were believed to consume sin and expose truth. The ordeal by fire was a vivid demonstration of the medieval worldview. Justice was both earthly and heavenly, and survival in the flames was evidence of moral and spiritual righteousness. The ordeal by water ordeals were equally dramatic and varied by region. One common form involved submerging the accused in a river or pond, with binding of hands and feet. The belief was that water, as a pure and divine element, would reject the guilty. If the accused floated, it was a sign of guilt. If they sank and survived, they were deemed innocent. Other versions involved immersion with sacred objects or tests of endurance in cold water, designed to gauge divine protection. The ritual was often accompanied by prayers, chants, and strict supervision by both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. Water ordeals carried a particularly high risk of death, highlighting the brutal reality of medieval justice. Yet, for communities, the test provided a tangible demonstration that God Himself would intervene to uphold truth, reinforcing faith in both divine oversight and social order. Ordeals with objects beyond fire and water. Objects could serve as instruments of divine judgment. The accused might be required to swear upon holy relics, lift sacred weights, or carry consecrated items. Success implied innocence. Failure, guilt. These tests emphasize the symbolic weight of religious artifacts and the intertwining of ritual and law. Objects of faith were considered extensions of God's judgment. Their presence lent legitimacy to the ordeal, reassuring both the participants and the community that the process was divinely sanctioned. Even when outcomes were ambiguous, the ceremonial nature of the ordeal reinforced the moral authority of the church and the social hierarchy that depended on it. Ordeals as public spectacle ordeals were not private. They were performed in public spaces, often in the center of towns, at churchyards, or near lordly courts. The community observed, prayed, and interpreted the results. This public dimension served multiple functions. It reinforced social norms, educated the populace, and deterred potential wrongdoers through fear. The spectacle created a ritualized drama of morality. The accused stood as a visible representation of sin, the witnesses as arbiters of communal order, and the priest as the mediator of divine will. The outcome was a moral and spiritual lesson, demonstrating that justice, punishment, and redemption were inextricably linked to faith. The psychological toll for the accused, ordeals were psychologically harrowing. Anticipation of pain, fear of divine disfavor, and the pressure of public scrutiny created immense stress. The ordeal tested not only physical endurance, but mental resilience. Communities, too, experienced tension. The test of fire or water provided both anxiety and reassurance, reinforcing the belief that justice was observable and ordained. The threat of death or severe injury amplified the stakes. Survival could confer a newfound reputation for divine favor, while failure could result in execution or lifelong stigma. This extreme pressure underscores the intensity of medieval belief in divine judgment and the pervasive intertwining of fear, faith, and law. Regional variations. Different regions had distinctive practices. England, ordeals by hot iron or boiling water were common in the Anglo-Saxon period, with legal codifications providing detailed instructions for judges. France, trials by ordeal were often used to settle disputes over land, inheritance, or serious accusations, sometimes combined with symbolic gestures like oath-taking on sacred relics. Germany, judicial texts describe elaborate ceremonies involving water, weights, and fire, emphasizing both divine supervision and social ritual. These variations highlight the flexibility of medieval justice, adapting to local customs while maintaining the central belief in divine intervention. Decline of the ordeal. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the ordeal began to decline, especially with the rise of evidence-based legal systems and the increasing influence of Roman law. Skepticism regarding divine judgment grew, and secular courts gained authority over matters previously resolved through extreme trials. Yet, the cultural memory of ordeals persisted, influencing folklore, literature, and ceremonial practices for centuries, even as legal systems evolved. The spectacle, ritual, and moral symbolism of the ordeal left an indelible mark. It demonstrated the medieval conviction that truth was inseparable from faith, and that human justice alone was insufficient without divine oversight. Symbolic significance. Trial by ordeal exemplified several core medieval beliefs. Divine justice. God was the ultimate arbiter of truth. Moral instruction. Ordeals educated communities about sin, punishment, and righteousness. Social control. Public rituals reinforced hierarchical authority and social norms. Theater of faith. Ordeals dramatized the tension between human action and divine will. The ordeal was thus more than a legal procedure. It was a performance of morality and divine oversight, making the law both visible and sacred. Integration with other judicial practices. Ordeals often complemented other methods. Trial by combat. Inconclusive accusations might proceed to physical duel. Ecclesiastical courts. Spiritual oversight ensured the ordeal adhered to religious principles. Punishments and public shaming. Failure in an ordeal could lead to further consequences, blending spiritual and corporal justice. This integration illustrates the multi-layered nature of medieval justice, where fear, faith, spectacle, and authority were interwoven into every judgment. Closing reflections. Trial by ordeal stands as a stark reminder of the intersection between faith and fear in the medieval world. The flames of fire, the immersion in water, and the ritualized tests of objects were more than punitive measures. They were expressions of a worldview where divine will was visible in the material world. For the accused, the ordeal was a literal trial by fire or water. For the community, It was a moral lesson in courage, obedience, and piety. And for history, it remains a compelling window into a society where justice was not only about human judgment, but about the direct and immediate presence of God in human affairs. As we move to Chapter 19, we will explore the most infamous cases of medieval trials, from sensational crimes to brutal punishments, revealing the extremes to which faith, fear, and law intertwined in the shadows of Europe. Chapter 19. Notorious Trials and Legendary Punishments. The shadows of medieval justice were cast not only by abstract laws, but by the spectacular trials that captured the imagination of entire communities. Some trials became legendary for their brutality, the cunning of the accused, or the severity of the punishment. They illustrate the extremes of a world where crime, fear, and divine authority converged into dramatic, unforgettable spectacles. Throughout Europe, stories of notorious trials circulated widely, preserved in chronicles, court records, and oral tradition. These events served as both cautionary tales and communal entertainment, reinforcing the moral and social hierarchies of the time. They also reveal the medieval mindset, where guilt and innocence were intertwined with divine will, fear, and political maneuvering. The trial of the thief and the mercenary, one of the most common but hauntingly dramatic cases, involved thieves and mercenaries. A bandit caught in the act of plundering a village could face a trial by ordeal or be publicly executed. In some instances, the accused was chained to the gallows for days, awaiting the verdict of a local judge or the outcome of a divine test. Villagers watched in fear and fascination as their fate, and that of their community, was symbolically intertwined with the criminal's punishment. Mercenaries, hired soldiers who sometimes committed crimes under the guise of service, were also brought to trial. They were considered both dangerous and cunning, and their trials were often elaborate theatrical events, involving interrogation, torture, and the threat of death. These trials reinforced the perception that social stability depended not only on law enforcement, but on the visible demonstration of justice. Witch trials and the hunt for sorcery. The fear of witchcraft reached a fever pitch in the late Middle Ages. Women and men accused of sorcery or malevolent magic were subjected to trials that combined superstition, law, and ritual. Evidence was often based on rumor, jealousy, or misinterpretation of natural events. A crop failure, a sudden illness, or an unexplained accident could trigger accusations. Trials were often horrific. The accused might be subjected to ordeals by water, submerged in icy rivers, or interrogated under torture, using thumbscrews, racks, or branding. Confessions were extracted in ways that modern eyes find unimaginable, often including self-incrimination of magical practices that never occurred. Communities witnessed the executions, usually by burning at the stake, as a public affirmation of moral and divine order. Witch trials reveal not only fear of the supernatural, but also the intersection of law, religion, and social control. Accusations often targeted those on the margins of society, widows, healers, or the elderly. The trials reinforced conformity and obedience, demonstrating the terrifying power of both the church and secular authorities. The infamous case of heresy, the crime of defying the spiritual authority of the church, was considered a threat not only to individual souls, but to entire communities. One notorious trial involved a local preacher accused of spreading unorthodox teachings. The accused was brought before an ecclesiastical court, interrogated for weeks, and ultimately burned at the stake after refusing to recant. These trials were elaborate, with clergy, civic authorities, and even peasants participating in the proceedings. The purpose was both punitive and didactic, to display the consequences of challenging church authority. Public executions reinforced the moral and social hierarchy, while the ritualized nature of the trial emphasized the belief that divine justice would prevail over human transgression, political intrigue, and the high stakes. Not all trials involved common criminals or heretics. Some became legendary due to the political stakes involved. Noblemen accused of treason or conspiracy faced trials that were as much about power and influence as guilt. These trials were often manipulated by rivals, manipulated by bribes, or swayed by the favor of the king or pope. One famous example involved a noble accused of plotting against a neighboring lord. The accused was imprisoned, interrogated under threat of torture, and presented to the court with witnesses whose loyalty was bought. The trial was public, dramatic, and intended to warn others who might challenge authority. Even when evidence was thin, the spectacle of judgment and punishment ensured compliance and deterred dissent. Punishments that shocked Europe. The punishments meted out in these trials were designed to be memorable, instilling fear while demonstrating justice. Some of the most infamous included breaking on the wheel, where the condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, limbs shattered, and left to die slowly. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, particularly for treason, combining execution with symbolic dismemberment. Burning at the stake, a common punishment for heresy and witchcraft, intended to purify the soul while terrifying witnesses. Mutilation, such as cutting off hands, ears, or noses, leaving a permanent mark of guilt. These punishments were often public spectacles, with crowds gathering to witness the consequences of disobedience or moral failure. They were designed to impress upon communities the authority of law, the danger of crime, and the intertwining of divine and secular justice. Trial by combat revisited in addition to ordeals and executions. Trial by combat persisted as a method of resolving disputes, particularly among the nobility. Two parties would fight under strict rules, with victory interpreted as divine favor and moral justification. Combatants often trained for days, with armor, weapons, and strategy reflecting both skill and social status. Trial by combat was not only about physical prowess, but also symbolic justice. The winner was considered morally righteous, and the outcome settled disputes that could not otherwise be resolved. It was a ritualized extension of medieval belief, where God's will was manifest in the strength, courage, and survival of the combatant. Spectacle, memory, and moral education. Notorious trials were remembered for generations. Chroniclers recorded the events in vivid detail, ensuring that the lessons of fear, obedience, and divine authority persisted. Public executions, ordeals, and trials served as both warning and entertainment, reinforcing social norms while instilling awe and reverence for justice. The spectacle of punishment was a form of moral education. Communities internalized the consequences of crime and heresy, understanding that transgression was not only a personal risk but a threat to social cohesion. Justice, whether harsh or ritualized, was a communal experience, observed, remembered, and retold as part of the shared culture. The legacy of medieval trials, the infamous trials and punishments of the Middle Ages, left a lasting imprint on legal, cultural, and moral thought. They illustrate a world where justice was inseparable from faith, fear, and public performance. While modern law emphasizes evidence and rational judgment, medieval trials emphasized ritual, symbolism, and the visible demonstration of authority. Through these trials, society learned both obedience and caution. Communities were reminded that crime, heresy, and moral failure could invite divine retribution, public shame, or brutal execution. At the same time, these events reveal the human drama, courage, and desperation that colored the medieval experience of justice. Closing reflections. As we reflect on these notorious trials, it becomes clear that medieval justice was more than a legal system. It was a theater of morality, faith, and power. The accused stood at the intersection of law and divine will, and their fates illuminated the fragile balance between human ambition, fear, and the pervasive belief in God's judgment. The stories of thieves, heretics, nobles, and accused witches remind us that justice was a public, performative, and often terrifying experience. Every trial was a lesson, every punishment a warning, and every spectacle a reflection of the values, fears, and beliefs of a world shaped by both mortal and divine authority. As we move to Chapter 20, the final chapter, we will explore the legacy of these trials, their influence on modern justice, and the enduring fascination with medieval crime and punishment. A world where law, faith, and spectacle intertwined in ways both dark and mesmerizing. Chapter 20, Legacy of Fire, Water, and Combat. As the smoke cleared from countless trials, executions, and battles, the Middle Ages left behind a legacy that continues to fascinate, terrify, and educate. The spectacle of punishment, the fear of divine judgment, and the interplay of law, morality, and social order created a world both brutal and mesmerizing. Chapter 20 examines how the traditions of trial by fire, water, and combat shaped medieval society and left echoes that linger in modern justice, culture, and imagination. The enduring shadow of ordeals, trials by ordeal, fire, water, and combat were more than archaic rituals. They were reflections of medieval thought. People believed that God actively intervened in human affairs, revealing truth through physical tests. Plunging into icy water or holding a red-hot iron was not only a physical challenge, but a spiritual trial, a measure of divine favor. These ordeals left behind a dual legacy. On one hand, they were inhumanly harsh, exacting pain and suffering on the accused. On the other, they reflected a society grappling with uncertainty, seeking justice in a world with limited investigative tools. Chroniclers often depicted these trials in vivid detail, ensuring that the lessons of obedience, faith, and fear were passed down for generations. The medieval mind intertwined law, religion, and spectacle in ways that modern observers can scarcely imagine. Public spectacle and social control. The public nature of trials reinforced communal cohesion and deterrence. Town squares became stages for morality plays where fear and obedience were dramatized. Crowds witnessed the punishment of thieves, heretics, and sorcerers, absorbing lessons about the consequences of transgression. The spectacle was both educational and authoritarian, a tangible demonstration of the reach of law and the power of divine justice. Punishments were designed to be memorable: bodies burned at the stake, limbs shattered on wheels, and dual victories interpreted as God's judgment. These rituals ensured that social norms were internalized and community members remained vigilant against crime and moral failings. Moral and spiritual lessons beyond fear. Trials served a didactic purpose. The accused, whether guilty or innocent, became a moral example. Confession, penance, and repentance were central to many trials, highlighting the interplay between earthly law and spiritual salvation. Medieval communities were taught that crime was not only a legal violation but a sin against God, and punishment was necessary to restore moral balance. In this context, trial by fire, water, or combat symbolized spiritual purification as much as physical judgment. Fire could cleanse the soul as well as the body. Water could reveal truth and innocence. Combat could validate divine favor. Medieval people interpreted these ordeals through a framework of faith, understanding justice as an extension of divine will rather than merely human law. Political implications. Trials and punishments were also instruments of political control. Monarchs, lords, and church authorities used them to assert power, resolve disputes, and eliminate rivals. Noble conspirators accused of treason faced trial by combat, where victory could legitimize claims and defeat could destroy ambitions. Heretics and dissenters were tried not only for spiritual deviation, but for their potential threat to social and political stability. Intertwining justice with politics. Medieval authorities ensured that the public saw the law as both absolute and divine. The consequences of disobedience were clear: defy the church, the king, or social norms, and you risked excruciating pain, death, and eternal infamy. These lessons were carefully choreographed into public events that reinforced the social order. The human element behind every trial, every execution, and every duel. There were real human stories. Fear, desperation, courage, and cunning played out in courts, dungeons, and fields. A peasant stealing grain faced the terrifying prospect of mutilation. A noble plotting rebellion balanced ambition with mortal danger. An accused witch or heretic navigated a web of rumor, superstition, and institutional authority. These stories highlight the complexity of medieval life. Crime was never purely criminal. It was social, moral, and spiritual. Punishment was never merely punitive. It was theatrical, symbolic, and instructive. Understanding these human dimensions allows modern audiences to see the medieval justice system as a reflection of society, belief, and survival rather than arbitrary cruelty alone. Evolution of justice over time. The brutal trials of fire, water, and combat gradually gave way to more rational legal systems. The rise of evidence-based courts, professional judges, and codified law marked a shift toward fairness and consistency. Yet the memory of medieval justice persists in literature, folklore, and historical consciousness. The fearsome ordeals, dramatic punishments, and public spectacles have influenced stories, films, and documentaries for centuries, reminding us of the extremes to which societies once went to uphold law and morality. Even today, echoes of these practices survive symbolically. Legal rituals, oaths, and the moral weight of public opinion carry forward elements of medieval belief. That justice is not only a human construct, but a reflection of ethical and societal order, cultural and historical fascination. The legacy of trial by ordeal continues to captivate historians, writers, and audiences. Chronicles and court records provide detailed accounts of the pain, fear, and social dynamics of these trials. Folktales and legends immortalize the drama, ensuring that the medieval imagination remains vivid. Public executions, ordeals by fire and water, and trial by combat occupy a prominent place in popular culture, shaping perceptions of the Middle Ages as a world of intense moral and physical stakes. This fascination also reflects a broader human curiosity about extremes of justice, survival, and morality. The medieval experience challenges modern assumptions about fairness, punishment, and divine authority, offering lessons about the evolution of law, ethics, and human behavior. Final reflections as we conclude this journey through the history of trial by fire, water, and combat. It becomes clear that these practices were more than curiosities. They were foundational elements of medieval society. They reveal a world where law, faith, and public spectacle intertwined, where crime, punishment, and morality were inseparable, and where the consequences of transgression were always visible, dramatic, and profound. The Middle Ages were a period of stark contrasts: cruelty and compassion, fear and faith, chaos and order. Through the lens of trial and punishment, we glimpse the human need to enforce morality, assert authority, and navigate a precarious existence. These trials, while extreme, were attempts to create justice, maintain social cohesion, and interpret divine will in a world that offered few certainties. As night falls and the stories of fire, water, and combat fade into memory, the lessons remain. We are reminded of the resilience, ingenuity, and courage of those who lived through a world where justice was visible, morality was absolute, and survival depended on understanding both human and divine law. The legacy of medieval trials lives on, not only in history books, but in our collective imagination. It is a reminder that justice, spectacle, and morality are intertwined threads in the human story, and that the past continues to teach, warn, and fascinate, even as we drift into the calm, dark shadows of forgotten slumber. As our journey through the trials of fire, water, and combat comes to a close, remember that these stories are more than brutality. They are reflections of human morality, law, and resilience. The echoes of medieval justice linger, not in the pain, but in the courage, ingenuity, and survival of those who lived in a world where every choice carried weight. Thank you for joining Forgotten Slumber. May these shadows of history guide you gently into rest, and may the lessons of the past settle like whispers as you drift into sleep. Sleep well, and let the memories of forgotten trials fade softly into the night.